The morning Elizabeth Carter buried her father in the Virginia heat, she didn't cry. She stood at that grave with mud on her boots and a sealed letter in her fist. A letter that said her family's land now belonged to Thomas Caldwell. She had 30 days. She had no money. She had no one. But when Caldwell's carriage rolled up that same afternoon, Elizabeth didn't step back. She stepped forward. If you've ever been counted out by someone who had everything, keep watching. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Virginia. Summer, 1817. The letter was tucked beneath a loose floorboard under her father's desk, folded twice, sealed with plain wax, and buried like something meant never to be found. Elizabeth Carter discovered it the same morning she washed his body, the same morning she pressed her palms flat against the old kitchen table just to keep from falling down. She had already spoken to the pastor. She had already arranged the burial. She had already told herself she would not fall apart until after. But the letter broke that promise wide open. It was a debt agreement, handwritten, signed with her father's name, Robert Carter, and countersigned by Thomas Caldwell, merchant and landowner, dated 3 years prior. According to the terms written in clean, careful script, the Carter family farm, 42 acres of Virginia bottomland, the only thing of real value her father had ever owned, had been put up as collateral against a loan of $240. A loan that, with accumulated interest recorded in Caldwell's own hand, had now grown to more than $400. Elizabeth read the document twice, then a third time. The numbers were wrong. She was not a trained accountant, but she had been keeping her father's books since she was 14 years old. She knew how interest compounded. She knew what 3 years of payments looked like, and the figures in that letter did not match. The progression was too steep. The compounding rate that Caldwell had written into the agreement was not standard. It was punishing. Designed, and she felt the word land in her chest like a stone, designed to be unpayable. Her father hadn't lost the farm because he was careless. He had been maneuvered into losing it. She set the letter on the table. She pressed her fingertips together, and she thought very carefully about what to do next. Thomas Caldwell arrived at the Carter farmhouse that same afternoon, before the burial dirt had even dried. Elizabeth heard the carriage from inside. She heard the creak of the wheels, the shift of harness leather, the careful footsteps of a man who had done this particular errand before and knew exactly how to pace himself. She did not rush to the door. She folded the debt letter, placed it back in the envelope, and set it beside the window where the afternoon light hit it clearly. When she opened the door, Caldwell was already standing on the porch. He was a large man, not tall exactly, but broad, with a way of taking up space that seemed deliberate. He wore a good coat despite the heat. His hat was expensive. He held it in one hand and smiled at her with the patient, practiced warmth of a man accustomed to being received. "Miss Carter," he said, "I am deeply sorry for your loss. Your father was a man of character." "He was," Elizabeth said. She did not invite him in. Caldwell's smile held. "I expect you found the paperwork by now. I would have come sooner, but I wanted to give you the morning." "How generous," Elizabeth said. He studied her for a moment. Whatever he had been expecting, tears perhaps, or immediate pleading, or the fumbling panic of a young woman alone. Her stillness seemed to give him pause. He recovered quickly. "The agreement is straightforward," he said. "The debt stands at $412. Given your current circumstances, I think it would be simplest if you accepted a settlement. Take whatever you can carry, vacate the property within 30 days, and we close the matter quietly. No courts, no lawyers, no unpleasantness." "No unpleasantness," Elizabeth repeated. "Precisely." She looked at him. She took her time. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "the interest rate written into that agreement is not legal under Virginia debt statutes." The smile did not leave his face, but something behind his eyes shifted slightly. "I beg your pardon?" "The compounding structure," she said, 3.5% per quarter. The legal ceiling under Virginia statute is 2%. My father signed a document that was written to grow beyond what he could ever repay. That's not a debt agreement, Mr. Caldwell. That's a trap." Caldwell was quiet for a long moment. Then he said gently, "Miss Carter, you've just lost your father. You're grieving. This isn't the time to—" "You didn't come here to collect a debt," Elizabeth said. "You came here because you believe a woman alone cannot fight back." The words landed exactly where she intended them to. Caldwell put his hat back on his head. The patience in his expression had cooled into something harder. "You have 30 days, he said. "I would recommend using them wisely." He walked back to his carriage. He did not look at her again. Elizabeth stood in the doorway and watched until the wheels disappeared down the road. Then she went back inside, sat down at her father's desk, and began making a list of every farmer she knew within 20 miles. She buried her father the next morning. 6 people came. The pastor, 2 elderly neighbors whose own farms were struggling, the woman who had occasionally traded eggs with her mother before her mother passed, and a boy of about 12 who had sometimes helped her father with fencing and stood at the back with his cap held in both hands, not quite sure what to do with himself. It was a quiet burial. There was no oration. Elizabeth had written a few words herself, not about what her father was, but about what he had built, and she read them standing at the grave with the summer heat pressing down on everything like a hand. After, when the others had gone, she stayed. She stood alone at the grave for a long time, not crying, just standing. She was past crying, or at least that was what she told herself. The grief was there. She could feel it, settled deep beneath her ribs like a weight she would carry for the rest of her life. But grief, she had discovered, did not stop other things from needing to be done. It just made them harder. "I found the letter," she said, to no one in particular, or perhaps to him. "I know what happened. I'm going to fix it." She wasn't certain she believed it yet, but she said it anyway, out loud, in the heat and the quiet. Then she picked up her father's old leather satchel from the ground beside her, slung it over her shoulder, and walked back toward the farmhouse. Her father's seed ledger was the first thing she retrieved. It was a battered book, brown leather, water-stained at the corners, in which Robert Carter had recorded 30 years of planting cycles, soil conditions, seasonal yield variations, and the results of his own careful experiments with crop rotation on Virginia bottomland. Other farmers had borrowed from it. A few had copied portions. Her father had considered it his life's work, and he had been right. Elizabeth set it on the table beside the debt letter and the rough list she was building. Over the next 2 days, she went visiting. She didn't tell anyone what she was looking for right away. She went to the Harmon farm first, bringing a small jar of the lavender and comfrey salve her father had always kept on hand, because Mabel Harmon had been struggling with joint pain for the better part of a year. They sat on the porch and talked about the heat and the price of corn at the Carwick market, and after a while, Elizabeth said, casual as she could manage, "I don't suppose your father ever did business with Caldwell?" Mabel's face tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Once," she said. "Years back. We paid it off early. Took everything we had, but we paid it." "Do you still have the agreement?" A pause. "Why do you ask?" "Because I do," Elizabeth said, "and I think mine might not be the only one that was written strangely." She said it carefully. She didn't want to frighten anyone, and she didn't want to make accusations she couldn't yet support. But Mabel looked at her for a long moment, and then stood up and went inside, and came back with a folded paper she had been keeping in a tin box under the kitchen floorboards. The interest rate in the Harmon agreement was 3% per quarter. Elizabeth wrote that down. She visited 4 more farms over the following 3 days. Not everyone would talk to her. One farmer, a man named Prescott, who owed Caldwell significantly and knew it, shut his door in her face without a word. 2 others were polite but vague, their eyes carrying the particular dull fear of people who have decided that hoping for better is more dangerous than accepting worse. But the Whitfield widow showed her a ledger of her own payments. And old Samuel Breck, who was 81 and apparently had decided that at his age he had nothing further to lose, pulled out an agreement he had signed 17 years earlier and handed it to Elizabeth with shaking hands and said, "I always knew something was wrong with that document. Always. Nobody believed me." "I believe you," Elizabeth said. By the end of the week, she had 4 documents. including her father's, that was 5. She had a list of discrepancies. She had a rough argument, not a legal one, not yet, but a factual one. And she had begun to understand that what Thomas Caldwell had built was not just a successful merchant's business. It was a system, methodical, patient, and nearly invisible. She brought everything to the small table beside the window and spread it out and stared at it. The problem was that having evidence and being able to use it were not the same thing. She was a 26-year-old woman with no legal training, no political connections, no money, and 30 days, now 22, to figure out what came next. The harvest market at Carwick ran every Thursday, and the following Thursday, Elizabeth went. She brought her father's seed collection, the rare heritage varieties he had spent years cultivating and preserving, which she had carefully wrapped and labeled, and a batch of the herbal remedies she had been preparing since she was a girl. Her mother had taught her the medicines. Her father had taught her the plants. Together, she had developed a small line of salves, tinctures, and dried preparations that she had been selling quietly for 2 years to supplement the farm's income. She set up at the edge of the market with a plain table and no sign, because she couldn't afford to have one made, and she began selling. The townspeople of Carwick were not unkind exactly. They were cautious in the particular way of small communities where everyone's fortunes were connected and no one wanted to be seen taking sides. A few women bought salve. A few farmers looked at the seed packets with genuine interest. Most people offered her that particular brand of polite sympathy, warm enough to feel benign, hollow enough to provide no real warmth at all. She heard by midday what they were saying. Too educated for her own good. Too stubborn. A woman who thought she understood documents and law and money, when everyone knew that Robert Carter had simply borrowed more than he could repay, and it was a sad story, but there it was. Better for her to accept Caldwell's offer and find a situation somewhere, work as a housekeeper perhaps, or a schoolteacher's assistant, and stop making trouble. Elizabeth finished selling her seeds. She counted her money. She bought a loaf of bread and a small piece of hard cheese. She was wrapping them in cloth when she first noticed him. William Anderson was not hard to notice. He was not the tallest man at the market, nor the loudest. But there was something about the way he moved through a crowd that made space without demanding it. He was perhaps 34, lean and dark-haired, with the kind of face that had been outdoors often enough to have lines in it that shouldn't have been there for a man his age. He dressed well, but not extravagantly. Good boots, a clean coat, no unnecessary ornamentation. He was accompanied by a man Elizabeth didn't recognize, a slightly younger fellow who was talking rapidly and gesturing at various market stalls. Anderson was not listening to him. He was watching the crowd. Several people made immediate efforts to greet him. Elizabeth watched 3 different women steer themselves deliberately into his path. She watched a cluster of merchants straighten their displays as he approached. She watched the slight, barely perceptible shift in the whole market's orientation, the way a room changes when money enters it. She turned back to her table. She was trying to work out the best approach to the county clerk's office, where she believed the original loan registrations would be filed, when a shadow fell across her table and a voice said, "That's a Hopi white corn variety." She looked up. William Anderson was standing across the table from her. He was looking at the seed packet she had labeled in her own careful handwriting, not at her. His companion was nowhere in sight. "Yes," she said. "Where did you get it?" "My father cultivated it from seeds he traded for 20 years ago. He spent a decade on the germination rates." Anderson picked up the packet carefully. He turned it over. "I've been trying to source this variety for 3 years," he said. "Every agricultural supplier I've written to either doesn't have it or sells a degraded strain." He looked up at her. "How much?" Elizabeth looked at him steadily. "That packet isn't for sale," she said. "It's the last of that particular strain. The rest are in the ground." "In the ground where?" She held his gaze. "On land I intend to keep." Something in his expression shifted. Not dramatically. He was not a man who apparently did things dramatically, but the quality of his attention changed. He set the packet back down on the table with the same care with which he had picked it up. Anderson, he said. William Anderson. I know who you are, Elizabeth said. Elizabeth Carter. You're Robert Carter's daughter. Yes. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her. Not the way most men looked at men at the Carwick market. Not weighing, not calculating, not performing. Just looking. As if he was trying to figure something out. I heard about your father, he said. I'm sorry. Thank you. Another pause. Then, I also heard about Caldwell. Elizabeth's hands stilled on the cloth she was folding. What did you hear? That he's moved to collect, that you have 30 days. He paused. That you told him the interest rate was illegal. She looked at him carefully. You heard that quickly. Carwick is a small town, he said, and people talk more when they think a woman is about to lose a fight. Is that what they think? Most of them, he said. Yes. Elizabeth folded the cloth, tucked it into her satchel. What about you? She said. William Anderson tilted his head slightly. The barest motion. The kind of thing a man did when he was genuinely considering a question rather than forming a polite answer. I think, he said slowly, that a woman who can read an illegal compound interest clause in a grief-stricken state, 2 days after her father's death, probably isn't about to lose anything she doesn't choose to lose. Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. I need access to the county clerk records, she said. Caldwell's loan registrations for the past 20 years. I have 5 agreements in hand that I believe are fraudulent. If the county filings match the documents I have, I can build a case. Anderson was quiet. I'm not asking for money, she said, before he could speak. I'm not asking for a lawyer. I'm not asking to be helped across a room. I'm asking for one thing. She looked at him directly. You own land in 3 counties. You know the clerk's office in Fredericksburg. I need someone to write a letter introducing me as a party conducting legitimate inquiry, so I'm not turned away at the door. He looked at her for what felt like a considerable time. Then he said, I'll do better than that. I'll take you there myself. Elizabeth shook her head. That will make people think I'm operating under your name. Would that be so terrible? Yes, she said. It would. Because when I win this, it needs to be because I was right, not because I stood next to the right man. He was quiet again. Then, quietly, he said, You said when? Yes, Elizabeth said. I did. He looked at her. And this time, whatever was working behind his eyes was closer to the surface. Not admiration exactly. Something quieter than that. Something that looked almost like recognition. I'll write the letter, he said. Thank you. He picked up the seed packet one more time, turned it over in his hands, and set it back down. I'll buy the seeds when you've kept your farm, he said. I'll sell them to you then, Elizabeth said, at a fair price. Anderson touched his hat, a brief, respectful motion, and walked back into the crowd. Elizabeth watched him go. She picked up the seed packet. She put it back in her satchel beside the debt agreements and the evidence she had gathered, and she stood for a moment in the summer heat of the Carwick market while the world went on around her, oblivious. Then she straightened her back, picked up her bag, and walked toward the road. She had 18 days left, and she had just begun. She was 3 days into her work at the county clerk's office in Fredericksburg when Caldwell found out. She didn't know how. She suspected one of the clerks, a young man who had seemed nervous from the first moment she walked in, but she couldn't prove it. What she knew was that on the 4th morning, she arrived at the courthouse to find that the files she had been working from had been reorganized. 3 ledger books that had been freely accessible were now listed as under audit review. The head clerk, a man named Farrow, who had previously been pleasant enough, received her that morning with his hands folded on his desk and told her, regretfully, that the records she had been reviewing were temporarily unavailable. Elizabeth stood at his desk and looked at the wall behind him. Then she said, Mr. Farrow, I need you to understand something. I have copies of 5 original debt agreements, all signed by the same party, all of which appear to carry interest rates in excess of the legal Virginia ceiling. If those records are restricted in a way that prevents me from cross-referencing the originals, I will have to conclude that the restriction itself is part of the problem. She paused. I don't want to conclude that. Pharaoh looked at her uncomfortably. I'm simply a woman reviewing public records, she said, which is my right, as it is the right of any citizen. The ledgers reappeared on the desk the following morning. Elizabeth said nothing about it. She simply sat down and kept working. By the end of the week, she had cross-referenced 11 agreements. All of them carried compound interest rates above the legal ceiling. Several had additional charges embedded in the structure, fees that were described in language vague enough to be nearly invisible on first reading. She copied everything by hand, carefully, in the neat script her father had spent years correcting until it was exactly right. She was sitting alone in the records room on the 7th day, working by the last of the afternoon light, when the door opened. She thought it was Pharaoh coming to close the room for the day. It was Thomas Caldwell. He came in alone. He closed the door behind him. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down without being invited, the same way he had stood on her porch, the ease of a man who had never been told he couldn't sit somewhere. Miss Carter, he said. Mr. Caldwell. He looked at the papers spread across the table. He took his time. You've been busy, he said. I'm a quick reader, she said. What exactly do you think you're building here? He asked. The tone was patient, conversational, mildly curious, as if her activity were an interesting hobby he had decided to inquire about. An argument, Elizabeth said. For what court? The county circuit court, to start. Federal district if necessary. Caldwell smiled. It was the same smile from her porch, practiced, warm, entirely without warmth. Elizabeth, he said, dropping the miss, she noticed, deliberately. You're a young woman without legal standing, without representation, and without the means to sustain a court proceeding. Even if your argument has merit, which I doubt you're qualified to assess, a case like this would take years. It would cost money you don't have. It would require witnesses who are far too frightened of me to testify. He leaned forward slightly. And at the end of it, you would still lose your farm. Because regardless of any procedural irregularities in the interest calculation, the debt is real. Your father signed that document. Elizabeth looked at him steadily. So I'm going to offer you something, he said. One more time, out of respect for your father, who was a decent man, even if he was not a careful one. Walk away. Accept the settlement. And I will ensure that no one in Carwick or Fredericksburg or any of the 3 surrounding counties ever hears a word about this conversation. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, And if I don't walk away? Caldwell's expression didn't change. Then I'll make sure everyone in those counties hears a great deal about it, and none of what they hear will be kind to you. Elizabeth looked at the papers on the table. She straightened one edge of a document that didn't need straightening. Then she looked back at him. Mr. Caldwell, she said, my father was a careful man. He was one of the most careful men I have ever known. He was not perfect. Nobody is. But he did not sign a document he didn't read, and he did not spend 20 years working that land without keeping accounts. She held his gaze. You chose him because he was old and struggling and proud. You chose him because you thought a man like that wouldn't have a daughter like me. Caldwell stood up. 14 days, he said. He left. Elizabeth sat alone in the records room as the light failed. She sat very still. She was afraid, genuinely afraid, in a way she hadn't let herself feel fully until this moment. He was not wrong about the difficulty. He was not wrong about the cost or the time or the fear of witnesses. But he was wrong about one thing. She was not alone. She just hadn't used that fact yet. She rode to the Anderson estate the following morning. It was a significant property. Not ostentatious, but substantial. Good fencing, maintained outbuildings, land that had clearly been worked by someone who understood what they were doing. She was shown to a study where Anderson was standing at a tall table covered in maps and what appeared to be soil samples arranged in small labeled jars. He looked up when she came in. He found me at the courthouse, she said without preamble. Anderson set down what he was holding. What did he say? She told him. All of it. Anderson listened without interrupting, which she had already come to expect from him. He did not pace, did not perform concern, did not reach for empty reassurance. When she finished, he said, "What do you need?" "Access to a lawyer," she said. "Not to represent me. To advise me on procedural standing. I need to know exactly what the circuit court will require before I file anything." "I know a man in Richmond," Anderson said. "Good lawyer. He's handled land cases before." He paused. "He'll see you if I send a letter." "Send it in both our names," Elizabeth said. "Equally. I don't want to show up as your client." He looked at her. "You understand that makes this harder for you?" "Yes," she said. "You understand that if you'd let me put you under my name, Caldwell would almost certainly settle within a week." "Yes," she said. "I know. And you still won't." "If I win this under your name," Elizabeth said, "then the farmers who gave me their documents, the Harmons, old Samuel Breck, the Whitfield widow, they won't see their agreements overturned. They'll see one woman get lucky because she knew the right man. Nothing changes for them." Anderson was quiet for a moment. "But if I win it on the law," she said, "then it sets precedent. Every agreement Caldwell wrote gets scrutinized. Every farmer he did this to has grounds to come forward." He looked at her for a long time. "You're not trying to save your farm," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm trying to save my farm," Elizabeth said, "and the Harmon farm, and the Whitfield farm, and every farm that Caldwell has been quietly taking apart for 20 years, while everyone looked away because it was easier than believing it was happening." Anderson picked up his pen. He pulled a sheet of paper toward him. "We'll write to Richmond together," he said. Elizabeth pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. They worked for 3 hours. Outside, the summer heat settled over Virginia like something alive, pressing down on everything. The fields, the roads, the quiet farms with their secrets and their debts and their long-buried agreements tucked into tin boxes under kitchen floorboards. And in a study that smelled of maps and soil and ink, two people who had both learned early to rely on themselves sat across from each other and built the beginning of something neither of them had a name for yet. The letter to Richmond came back in 4 days. Elizabeth was at her father's farm when Anderson's man rode up with the envelope. She was in the middle of pulling fence posts. The northern boundary line had been neglected for 2 seasons, and whatever happened with Caldwell, the farm still needed to function. And she stopped and wiped her hands on her work apron and opened it standing right there in the field. The lawyer's name was Edmund Hale. He would see her. He had reviewed the summary Anderson had enclosed with the inquiry letter, and he had written back in precise, economical language that told her 2 things immediately. He was good at his work, and he believed she had something. "The interest structure you describe," Hale had written, "if accurately reported, represents a clear violation of Virginia Debt Statute Section 14, Article 3. However, the question of enforcement is considerably more complex than the question of violation. A circuit court petition will require original documentation, sworn testimony from affected parties, and a demonstration of pattern, not isolated incident. The latter will be your most difficult task." Elizabeth read that last sentence 3 times. Pattern, not isolated incident. She already had 5 agreements. She needed more. She folded the letter, tucked it into her satchel, and went back to pulling fence posts. She had 11 days left. The problem with asking frightened people to do brave things was that they were frightened for real reasons. Elizabeth understood this. She was not naive about it, and she was not impatient in the way of someone who had never been frightened themselves. But she also knew that the fear Caldwell relied on, the particular fear of farmers and small landowners who had signed documents they couldn't fully parse, who owed money to a man with more power than they had, who believed that the system which governed their lives was fundamentally arranged in his favor. That fear was both real and cultivated. Caldwell had spent 20 years making sure people believed they couldn't win. It was as much a part of his business as the compound interest. So when she went back to the farms, she didn't ask for courage. She asked for paper. "I don't need you to testify," she told Mabel Harmon, sitting on the same porch where they had talked 2 weeks before, the same late afternoon heat pressing down on everything. "Not yet. I need you to let me make a copy of your agreement. That's all. You keep the original. Nothing changes for you unless you choose to make it change. Mabel looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who has been disappointed by processes she was told she could trust. "And if Caldwell finds out I gave you the paper?" "He already knows I'm building a case," Elizabeth said. "What he doesn't know is how much I have." She held Mabel's gaze. "Right now, he thinks I'm a young woman with a grief and a theory. Every document I add changes what I am." "What does it change you into?" "Someone he should have left alone," Elizabeth said. Mabel was quiet for the long moment. The heat moved around them. From somewhere inside the farmhouse, a pot knocked against a stove. Then Mabel stood up and went inside and came back with the tin box. By the end of that same week, Elizabeth had 9 agreements. She had ridden to farms she'd never visited before, places she knew only by name from her father's ledger, people she introduced herself to with nothing but her own name and her father's and the quiet, direct explanation of what she was trying to do. 3 doors closed on her. One man told her she was going to get herself and everyone around her hurt, and she thanked him for his honesty and left. But 6 doors opened, and behind each one was a family sitting on a document that had been slowly, quietly, legally robbing them for years. An old woman named Clara Birch had paid Caldwell $460 over 12 years on a loan that should have been cleared in 7. She had never questioned the figures because she trusted the process. When Elizabeth showed her the math, laid it out in plain addition on the back of an envelope, Clara Birch looked at it for a very long time and then said, in a voice that was completely flat, "I worked twice as hard as I needed to." "Yes," Elizabeth said, "you did. Because he wrote numbers on paper that I couldn't read properly." "Yes." Clara looked at her. She was perhaps 65, with hands that showed every year of Virginia farm work. "What do you need from me?" "Your agreement, if you still have it. And if you're willing, eventually, your name." "You mean testify?" "Only if you're willing. And only when there's enough on the other side to make sure you're protected." Clara Birch looked at the envelope with the math on the back. Then she looked at Elizabeth. "My husband died thinking he'd failed us," she said. "He died believing he'd been careless with money. He wasn't careless. Was he?" Elizabeth met her eyes. "No, ma'am," she said. "He wasn't." Clara stood up. She went inside. She came back with an agreement that was so old the folds had nearly worn through. "You keep that one," she said. "I don't want it in my house anymore." Elizabeth brought everything to Anderson's study on a Tuesday evening, 7 days before Caldwell's deadline. She spread it across the table. 9 agreements. Her copied records from the Fredericksburg courthouse, the letter from Hale in Richmond, and her own handwritten analysis that now ran to 14 pages. Anderson stood on the other side of the table and went through it without speaking for nearly 20 minutes. When he looked up, his expression was not what she had expected. "This is enough," he said. "For the petition," she said, "not for a verdict." "For the petition," he agreed. "And the petition, if it's granted, suspends the debt collection while the court reviews, which means your 30 days stop mattering." Elizabeth looked at him. "How certain are you? Hale will know better than I do. But what you've built here—" He paused. He looked at the table. "Elizabeth, I've done business in this state for 10 years. I've dealt with lawyers and clerks and county officials, and what you've assembled in 2 weeks by yourself, with no legal training and no support, is more rigorous than half the formal inquiries I've ever seen produced." She didn't let herself feel that. Not yet. "I need Hale to confirm the petition can be filed before my deadline. I'll ride to Richmond myself," Anderson said. She shook her head. "Write him again. Tonight. Tell him I'll come to Richmond in 3 days. I'll present it in person." Anderson looked at her. "That's a 2-day ride." "I know." "You'll have 3 days left when you get back." "I know that too." Howe was quiet for a moment. He was looking at her in that way he had, not the way most people looked at her, which was either through the lens of her situation or through the lens of their own assessment of what her situation meant about her. He looked at her the way a person looked at something they were genuinely trying to understand. "Will you let me come with you?" he said. Elizabeth considered it. She considered it carefully, because it wasn't a simple question. There was the practical reality that a woman traveling to Richmond alone in 1817 was more vulnerable than a woman traveling with a companion, and she knew it. There was the professional reality that arriving at Hale's office with Anderson beside her would lend a weight to her presentation that she could not generate alone, and she knew that too. And there was the other reality, the one she kept at a careful distance, which was that she had stopped being indifferent to William Anderson somewhere around the third hour of writing that letter together, and she was not entirely sure what to do with that. "You can come," she said, "but you don't speak in the meeting with Hale." Something moved across his face that might, on a less composed man, have been a smile. "Understood," he said. They left before dawn. The road to Richmond was long and dry, and for the first 2 hours neither of them spoke much beyond the necessary. The pace, the route, the weather, which showed every sign of turning before evening. Elizabeth had her satchel across her lap and spent most of the early miles reviewing her notes, which she had organized and reorganized so many times that she could have recited the figures without looking at them. It was Anderson who broke the silence. "Tell me about your father's seed work," he said. She looked up. "You've told me what it is," he said. "The Hopi white corn, the crop rotation methodology. But you haven't told me how he did it, how he came to it." Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. She was surprised by the question. Not because it was inappropriate, but because it was unexpected. Most people, when they spoke to her about her father at all, spoke about him in terms of the farm, or the debt, or the circumstances of his death. They spoke about him as a problem or a tragedy or a data point in her current situation. Anderson was asking about his mind. He believed in listening to what the land already knew, she said, after a moment. Most farmers in Virginia in his generation were still planting the same 3 or 4 crops in rotation, the way it had been done since their grandfather's time. My father thought that was backwards. He thought you should start by studying what the land had done before you arrived on it, what grew naturally, what the soil wanted to produce. She paused. He traded letters with a man in Tennessee who had been studying indigenous farming methods for 30 years. They wrote to each other for 15 years without ever meeting. That's how he learned about the Three Sisters planting system. That's where the corn variety came from. He wrote for 15 years to a man he never met, Anderson said. He said the distance made it easier to be honest, Elizabeth said. He said when you can't see someone's face, you stop trying to perform for them. Anderson was quiet for a while. Then he said, "My father and I never talked about anything that mattered. Not once in his entire life." Elizabeth looked at him. "How was a landowner?" Anderson said. "A successful one, a respected one. He taught me everything about how to run an estate, crop yields, tenant management, tax structures, land surveys. He was thorough." He paused. "I have no idea what he thought about anything that wasn't a transaction." "Is that why the agricultural estate is abandoned?" she said. He glanced at her. Not surprised exactly, but attentive. "It was his project," he said. "Something he started and never finished. I told myself I was keeping it until I knew what to do with it. Mostly, I think I just didn't want to deal with the fact that he left it half done." Elizabeth turned this over. She thought about her father, who had talked too much sometimes, who had read to her from agricultural journals at the dinner table, who had told her things she didn't ask to know about soil acidity and seed viability and the difference between loam and clay, who had been, she understood now, doing the only thing he knew how to do, pouring knowledge into her because he believed, somewhere below the level of words, that it would matter someday. "Finish it," she said. Anderson looked at her. "The estate," she said. "Whatever he was building. Finish it." She paused. Not for him, for what it could be. He looked at the road ahead. He didn't answer, but something in the line of his shoulders changed, slightly, in a way she noticed and didn't comment on. They rode through the afternoon heat and into the early evening, and they talked about farming and land and soil and the particular stubbornness of Virginia bottomland in a drought year, and somewhere in the long miles between Carwick and Richmond, Elizabeth Carter stopped managing the distance between herself and William Anderson with quite the same careful precision she had been applying. She didn't let herself look at it too closely. She had a meeting to prepare for. Edmund Hale's office in Richmond was on the second floor of a building that smelled of old paper and serious purpose. Hale himself was a slight man of perhaps 50, with the precise, economical movements of someone who had learned long ago that time was finite and waste was a choice. He shook Anderson's hand, nodded to Elizabeth, and then looked at her satchel. "Is that everything?" he said. "Yes," Elizabeth said. 9 original agreements, certified copies of 11 county records, a 14-page analysis of the interest discrepancies, and letters from 3 parties willing to provide sworn statements. Hale looked at the satchel for a moment. Then he looked at her. "How long did this take you?" 13 days, Elizabeth said. Hale said nothing to that. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Anderson took the chair against the wall without being directed. Elizabeth sat down, opened the satchel, and began to present. She had rehearsed it. Not the words exactly, but the structure. The logical progression from individual document to pattern, from pattern to statutory violation, from violation to remedy. She had thought about what a lawyer would need to see, and she had built the presentation around those needs rather than around her own. She was not asking Hale to be moved by the injustice. She was asking him to see the argument. She talked for 40 minutes. Hale listened. He interrupted 3 times. Precise, technical interruptions about specific elements of the county records, the exact language of Virginia statute. One question about the chain of custody for Clara Birch's original document. He took notes in a cramped, rapid hand that she couldn't read from across the desk. When she finished, he looked at his notes for a long moment. Anderson hadn't said a word. Hale looked up. He looked at Elizabeth. "You understand," he said, "that even if the petition is granted and the collection is stayed, Caldwell will challenge. He will hire better lawyers than you can afford. He will delay. He will work every procedural mechanism available to him." "Yes," Elizabeth said. "This could take a year, possibly 2. "I know. You could lose the farm in the interim if the stay isn't honored or is successfully challenged. I know that as well," she said. "But if I do nothing, I lose it in 6 days." Hale looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Anderson. "You're not her attorney," he said. "No," Anderson said. "You're not here in a legal capacity." "I'm here because she asked me to come," Anderson said. "That's the full extent of it." Hale looked back at Elizabeth. Something in his expression had shifted. Not warmed exactly, but sharpened, in the way of a man who had revised an earlier assessment. "The petition can be filed tomorrow," he said. "I can have it before Judge Carver at the Carwick Circuit by the end of the week. Whether he grants the stay is not within my control, but the argument is sound." He paused. "I want the 3 sworn statement letters in hand before I file. Can you get them to me by morning?" Elizabeth reached into the satchel and set them on the desk. "I brought them with me," she said. Hale looked at them. Then he looked at her. Then he said, with a dryness that she suspected was the closest he came to humor, 13 days. "Yes," Elizabeth said. "Remarkable," he said. It didn't sound like a compliment exactly. It sounded like a statement of fact from a man who dealt in statements of fact. "What do you need from me before you file?" Elizabeth said. "A retainer," he said. "I'll work at reduced rate given the public interest nature of the case. $50 to begin." Elizabeth's jaw tightened slightly. She had $23 in her satchel. She had sold everything saleable from her father's farm stock over the past 2 weeks, and she had $23. She said nothing. Anderson said, from the chair against the wall, "The retainer is covered." Elizabeth turned and looked at him. He met her gaze steadily. "Not as your patron," he said. "As an interested party. I own land in 2 of the counties where Caldwell has active loan agreements. I have standing to contribute to the proceeding on my own basis." He paused. "That's the truth. It's also convenient." Elizabeth held his gaze for a moment. She recognized what he was doing. He was handing her a frame that allowed her to accept without it meaning what she feared it would mean. He was being careful with her pride, in the same way she was careful with other people's fear. She turned back to Hale. "File it tomorrow," she said. They stayed the night in Richmond, separate accommodations, on opposite sides of the same small boarding house, which was the only establishment that had rooms available at short notice. Elizabeth lay awake for a long time listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a city at night. She was not thinking about the petition, exactly. She had done what she could do about the petition. She was thinking about what Caldwell had said in the records room. He would make trouble. He had promised it. And he was not a man who made promises without intention to keep them. When she finally slept, she slept hard and dreamlessly, and she woke before the sun with the particular clarity of someone who has been running on nervous energy long enough that the body has stopped pretending it can do anything else. She found Anderson already awake in the small front room of the boarding house, a cup of coffee on the table in front of him, looking at nothing in particular. He glanced up when she came in. "Hale will file this morning," he said. "Good. We should be back in Carwick by tomorrow evening." "Yes." He looked at her. "How are you?" It was a simple question. She had been asked it dozens of times in the past 2 weeks by people who didn't actually want to know the answer, who were asking it because the social framework required them to, and because the question's function was to release them from responsibility for whatever she answered. Anderson asked it differently. He asked it the way her father had sometimes asked it, with enough quiet weight that it expected an honest response. "Tired," she said. "Afraid. Reasonably confident. Not necessarily in that order." "That sounds about right," he said. She sat down across from him. A woman appeared from the back room and set a cup on the table in front of Elizabeth, and Elizabeth wrapped both hands around it and let the warmth work into her palms. "Caldwell is going to come after my reputation," she said. "Not the legal case. My reputation. What kind of woman does this? Why I'm really doing it. Who I'm involved with and what that implies." She paused. "He's going to come after you too." Anderson nodded. He had clearly already considered this. "I want you to be prepared for what that looks like," she said. "Because people will believe him. Not everyone, but enough." "I know," he said. "And I want you to know that I won't." She stopped. She started again. "I won't expect you to absorb the damage on my behalf. This is my fight. If the association becomes costly for you, I won't hold it against you to step back." Anderson looked at her. He set down his cup. He looked at her with that particular directness that she had learned meant he was not about to say the easy thing. "Elizabeth," he said, "I have spent 10 years being careful. Careful with my land, careful with my money, careful with my associations, careful with every decision I've made since my father died and left me in charge of everything he built." He paused. "I have been extraordinarily, exhaustingly careful, and I have accomplished a great deal, and I have been alone for all of it." He held her gaze. "I'm not stepping back, not from the case, and not from this." The word "this" landed in the space between them with a weight neither of them commented on directly. Elizabeth looked at her coffee. "You don't know me well enough to say that," she said. "I know you well enough to know I want to," he said. Simple, straightforward, without performance. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, Richmond was beginning to wake up, the early sounds of a city that never quite fully slept. "Ask me something," she said. "Something you actually want to know." I thought about it. He took the question seriously, which she appreciated. "What are you going to do with the farm?" he said. "After. When the case is settled and the land is clear. What do you actually want to build?" She hadn't been asked that. Not once. Everyone had asked her what she was fighting against. No one had asked her what she was fighting toward, she told him. She told him about the seed ledger and her father's system, and the idea she had been carrying around for 3 years about what the Carter land could be. Not just a working farm, but a demonstration farm. A place where the agricultural methods her father had developed could be tested and documented and taught to neighboring farmers. A resource for the kind of small landowners that men like Caldwell preyed on precisely because they were isolated and uninformed. She talked for almost 20 minutes. She hadn't talked about it to anyone, and once she started she found she couldn't quite stop. When she finished, Anderson was looking at her with an expression that was different from anything she had seen on him before. "That's not a farm," he said. "That's an institution." "Eventually," she said. "Right now it's 42 acres and a seed ledger and a theory." "The best institutions start that way," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The morning moved around them. Then Elizabeth picked up her coffee and said practically, "We need to get back on the road." "Yes," Anderson said. And then, quieter, "Thank you for telling me." She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. They arrived back in Carwick on the evening of the second day, which left Elizabeth 4 days before Caldwell's deadline. She rode directly to the farm, stabled her horse, and found a note pinned to her front door. It was unsigned. The handwriting was unfamiliar. It said, in 6 words, "He has already been to town." She stood at her door in the failing light and held the note. She knew what it meant. She had expected it, had told Anderson it was coming, had built it into her calculations. But knowing something is coming and feeling it arrive are not the same thing, and for a moment, standing at the door of her father's house with the summer dark coming in around her, she felt the full weight of what she was up against. Caldwell had not waited. While she was in Richmond, he had moved. She went inside. She lit a lamp. She sat at her father's desk, where she had found the debt letter 3 weeks ago, and she thought about what she knew and what she didn't know and what she needed to find out before morning. Then she took out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write. She was not afraid of what he had said in town. She was afraid of what it would do to the people who had trusted her with their documents. The Harmons and Clara Birch and old Samuel Breck, who had handed her their most vulnerable possessions on the strength of her word. She was afraid of failing them. But fear, she had learned from a man who had spent his life studying what the land already knew, was not the same as incapacity. Fear was information. It told you where the stakes were real. She folded the paper. She picked up the lamp. She was going back out. She had 4 days. And Caldwell had made his first mistake. He had underestimated how much she was paying attention. The note had been left by Mabel Harmon's oldest boy. Elizabeth figured that out by mid-morning the next day, when she rode to the Harmon farm and found Mabel standing in her kitchen, with the particular stillness of a woman who had made a decision she wasn't sure she could live with. The boy, he was perhaps 15, serious-faced, with his mother's careful eyes, was sitting at the table, not looking at either of them. "What did he say?" Elizabeth asked. She kept her voice level. She had learned over the past 3 weeks that other people's panic was contagious, and she could not afford to catch it. Mabel turned from the window. "He came to the market," she said, 2 days ago, while you were in Richmond." She paused. "He didn't say your name directly. He never does. But he called it a misguided campaign. A young woman who had recently lost her father and was not thinking clearly, making accusations against honest businessmen, drawing good people into disputes that weren't theirs to join." Her voice was flat. "He talked about how hard it was to watch someone use grief as an excuse to avoid a legitimate financial obligation." Elizabeth said nothing. "He was very pleasant about it," Mabel said. "That's the worst part. He was pleasant and concerned, and everyone nodded and agreed it was a terrible shame." She looked at Elizabeth. "3 families came to me after. People who had talked to me before, who had seemed interested in what you were building." She stopped. "They're not coming forward. They said they can't afford the attention." Elizabeth absorbed this. "How many?" she said. 3 families, Mabel said. "Maybe 4. Do you still have your agreement?" Mabel looked at her. "Yes." "And you're still willing to let me use it?" A long pause. The longest pause yet. Elizabeth did not fill it. She waited, because she understood that what Mabel was deciding in that silence was not a small thing. It was the kind of decision that a person lived with for years afterward, regardless of which way it went. "Yes," Mabel said. "I'm still willing." Elizabeth let out a slow breath. "Then we're all right," she said. "We don't need the families who stepped back. We have enough." "Do we?" Mabel said. "We have to," Elizabeth said. What Caldwell had done at the market was only the beginning, and Elizabeth knew it. By the following morning, she had a clearer picture of the damage. She got it piece by piece, from the fragments that reached her through the particular informal network of women who ran beneath the visible surface of any small town. The women who talked to each other at wells and market stalls and church steps, and who knew, collectively, everything worth knowing about the community they lived in and were largely not credited for knowing. Caldwell had not confined himself to the market. He had visited the pastor. He had spoken to 2 of the county commissioners. He had had a private conversation with the editor of the Carwick Gazette, the details of which Elizabeth couldn't confirm, but whose effects she could already feel in the way the newspaper's owner looked past her on the street. He had told a version of events in which Elizabeth was not a woman fighting a fraudulent debt structure, but a troubled young woman, recently bereaved, financially desperate, advised by dubious parties, making reckless accusations against a prominent community figure. He had been careful not to say anything specific enough to constitute slander. He never was. He was too good at this. And then she heard the part that made her stop walking in the middle of the road and stand very still for a moment. He had talked about Anderson, not directly, not by name in most cases, but in the way Caldwell always worked, the well-placed implication, the concerned observation, the gentle suggestion that perhaps a young unmarried woman traveling to Richmond with a wealthy landowner was not exactly what a proper investigation looked like. That perhaps the relationship between Elizabeth Carter and William Anderson was less professional than it appeared. That perhaps Miss Carter's interest in the legal case was not entirely separate from her interest in other advantages. She stood in the road and breathed through it. Then she walked to Anderson's estate. She found him in the stable, which surprised her. He didn't seem like a man who spent time in stables. But he was there, not overseeing, actually doing it himself, working with a quiet, focused efficiency that made her revise another assumption she'd been carrying about him. He saw her face before she said anything. "He's moved," Anderson said. "Yes." She told him. All of it, including the part about the implication regarding the 2 of them. She told it straight, without softening, because she needed him to understand exactly what they were dealing with, and softening it would not serve either of them. When she finished, Anderson was quiet for a moment. His jaw was set. "That's deliberate," he said. "Of course it's deliberate. He's trying to make you pull back from the case to protect your reputation." "Yes," Elizabeth said. "And he's trying to make you pull back to protect yours." Anderson looked at her. "How much damage has he actually done, honestly?" Elizabeth considered. "The 3 families who stepped back. That's real. I may not get them back. The newspaper is probably not going to be friendly to us going forward. The commissioners." She paused. "I don't know yet about the commissioners. That depends on whether Caldwell has more leverage with them than I think. And the petition? Hale's filing? That's separate. The court doesn't run on town opinion." She held his gaze. "But the witnesses do. If people are afraid to testify, or afraid to be seen associated with the case, the legal argument weakens." Anderson looked at her steadily. "What do you need?" "I need to find out what he said to the commissioners," she said. "Specifically, I need to know if he's trying to block the petition at the court level or just at the community level." "I can find that out," Anderson said. "Not by asking them directly," she said. "If you go to them, it confirms his narrative. It looks like you're intervening on my behalf." He thought about it. "There's a man on the county commission named Whitaker. He's been a tenant of mine for 6 years. He'll tell me the truth if I ask the right way." He paused. "I won't ask directly. I'll ask about something adjacent and let him fill the space." Elizabeth recognized the approach. It was the same one she'd used with half the farmers she'd visited. "Good," she said. She turned to go. "Elizabeth." His voice stopped her at the stable door. She turned. "What he said about us," Anderson said. "Does it change anything for you?" She held his gaze for a moment. "It changes that I need to be more careful about being seen here," she said. "Not what I think about being here." He held that for a moment. Then he nodded. "Once." She left. "Come back." The petition reached Judge Carver's desk in Carwick on a Thursday morning. Elizabeth knew because Hale had written her the moment it was filed, and she had been watching the courthouse from a careful distance. Not lurking, she told herself, simply attending to her business in the adjacent street. When she saw Caldwell's lawyer, a man named Greer, enter the building at a speed that suggested he had been notified the moment the paperwork arrived. So Caldwell had someone inside the courthouse. She had suspected it. Now she was certain. She waited. By afternoon, she had her answer. Judge Carver had received the petition. He had not dismissed it. He had scheduled a preliminary hearing for the following Tuesday to determine whether the stay of collection would be granted pending full review. 4 days. She had 4 days until the hearing. She went home and sat at her father's desk and thought very hard about what she had and what she needed and what was possible in 4 days. The evidence was solid. Hale was good. The argument was sound. What she didn't yet have was a witness who would stand up in open court. Mabel Harmon had said she was willing. But willing in a kitchen and willing in a courtroom were different weights. Clara Birch was 65 and had worked her whole life on a farm and had never in her life walked into a courthouse. Old Samuel Breck was 81, and Elizabeth was not certain his testimony would be treated with the respect it deserved. She needed someone different, someone the court and the town would not be able to dismiss. She thought about it for a long time. Then she thought about what Anderson had said about his tenant, Whitaker, on the county commission. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. She was still writing when the knock came at her door. It was late, past 9, the summer dark, thick and warm, and she was not expecting anyone. She opened the door with the lamp in her hand and found a man she didn't recognize. He was perhaps 40, lean, with a face that had been weathered by outdoor work and a coat that was decent but not expensive. He held his hat in both hands and looked at her with an expression she recognized from the farms she had visited. Not hostility, not friendliness, but the careful neutrality of someone who hadn't decided yet. "Miss Carter?" he said. "Yes. My name is James Whitfield. My mother-in-law is Clara Birch." Elizabeth looked at him. "Come in," she said. He came in. He did not sit until she gestured toward the chair. He held his hat in his lap and looked at the papers on the desk and then at her. "My wife's mother told me what you're doing," he said. "She told me about the interest rates, about the agreements." He paused. "She told me you asked for her name." "I did," Elizabeth said, "and I told her it was her choice entirely." "It is," he said. "But she's 65 years old, and she's got bad knees, and she hasn't been outside this county in 20 years. He paused. "I'm asking to go in her place, if you'll have me." Elizabeth looked at him carefully. "Mr. Whitfield, do you have documentation?" He reached inside his coat and pulled out an agreement. He set it on the table. Elizabeth picked it up and read it. It was a Caldwell agreement. The same structure, the same interest rate pattern, dated 8 years prior. It was in the name of Clara Birch, and it was more damning than the copy she already had because it had a notation in the margin, in Caldwell's own handwriting, that read, "Extended rate approved, J.C." Elizabeth stared at the notation. J.C. Caldwell's initials. A handwritten confirmation, in his own hand, that he had personally approved an interest rate he knew was in excess of the legal ceiling. She looked up at James Whitfield. "How long have you had this?" 8 years, he said, "since my mother-in-law gave it to me for safekeeping." "Did you know what this notation meant?" "I knew something was wrong with the numbers," he said. "I didn't know the statute specifically, not until Clara told me what you'd explained to her." Elizabeth set the document down carefully. She took a measured breath. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "what you're holding is the most significant piece of evidence I have. Do you understand that? I understand that Caldwell took $400 from my wife's mother over 12 years that she didn't owe him," he said. "And I understand that my wife's father died believing he'd been a bad husband because he couldn't get ahead of those payments." His voice was quiet and completely level. "I'll stand up in any court in Virginia and say so." Elizabeth looked at him. She thought about the woman in the courthouse hallway who everyone saw coming. The young woman with the grief and the theory, and nothing behind her but determination. She thought about what it would look like if, standing beside Hale's careful legal argument, there was a man like this, a farmer, a son-in-law, a witness without agenda who had simply been sitting on a document for 8 years waiting for someone to ask the right question. "Tuesday morning," she said. "The circuit court. Can you be there?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. After he left, Elizabeth sat at the desk for a long time. She did not let herself feel the relief fully, because relief was a luxury she couldn't afford yet. But she let herself feel something. Then she picked up the document with the margin notation and read it again. And again. Extended rate approved. J.C. In his own hand. She had been building an argument from patterns and statistics and statutory violations. Compelling, rigorous, but abstract. Patterns could be disputed. Statistics could be challenged. Legal technicalities could be argued around by a good enough lawyer. And Caldwell had hired a good enough lawyer. But a man's own handwriting, confirming in 4 words that he had knowingly broken the law, was not a technicality. It was a confession. She rode to Anderson's estate at first light the following morning. She was at his door before the household was fully awake. His housekeeper, a stout woman named Mrs. Graves, who had clearly been managing Anderson's domestic life with competent authority for many years, looked at Elizabeth with an expression that was neither welcoming nor hostile, and then went to find him. Anderson came to the study in a coat he'd clearly put on in the past 3 minutes. He took one look at her face and said, "What happened?" She told him about Whitfield. She told him about the notation. She set the document on the desk and pointed at the margin. Anderson read it. His expression did not change dramatically, but his jaw did something specific. A slight tightening, the look of a man recalibrating rapidly. "J.C.," he said. His initials, his handwriting. Hale confirmed the pattern of notation in the county records. Caldwell used the same marginal annotation system in his business ledgers. "We can prove it's his hand." "This changes the character of the case," Anderson said. "Yes," she said. "This isn't just a statutory violation anymore. This is knowing, deliberate fraud. The court can't ignore that." "No," she said. "They cannot." She paused. "I need you to tell me about Whitaker. What did he say?" Anderson had spoken to his tenant commissioner 2 days prior. "Caldwell spoke to the commissioners," he said. "He framed it as a personal matter, a neighbor's grief, a misunderstanding of business practice. He asked them not to prejudice the court's process." He paused. What he was actually doing was making sure they knew his version first. "Did it work?" "With 2 of them," Anderson said. "Whitaker is not one of those 2. Elizabeth processed this." "So the court hearing is genuine," she said. "Carver isn't pre-decided." "As far as Whitaker knows, which means everything depends on what happens Tuesday." Elizabeth nodded. She picked up the document. She held it for a moment. Then something occurred to her. Something she should have thought of earlier, and the fact that she hadn't made her breath catch slightly. "Greer," she said. Anderson looked at her. "Caldwell's lawyer. He filed a response to the petition this morning. Hale wrote me." She set the document back down. "The response says Caldwell is prepared to present evidence that the Carter debt agreement was not only legal, but was signed with full understanding, and that additional claims of fraud are unsupported." She looked at Anderson. "He said additional claims. Meaning he knows about the other agreements." "He knows I have them," she said. "But he doesn't know what's in them. He doesn't know about this," she gestured at the notation. "He knows I have a case. He doesn't know I have a confession." "And you want to keep it that way until Tuesday," Anderson said. "Hale doesn't even know yet," she said. "I'm riding to Fredericksburg this afternoon to show him. But I need it held close until the hearing. If Caldwell finds out what we have, he'll find a way to challenge it," Anderson said. "Question the provenance. Claim the document is altered." "Exactly." She held his gaze. "Nobody can know. Not your household, not your tenants, not anyone in Carwick." "Understood," he said. "I mean it, William." It was the first time she had used his given name. Neither of them commented on it. But something shifted in the room. a small, quiet thing, like a room finding its level. "I understand," he said. "No one." The ride to Fredericksburg was shorter now that she knew the road. She reached Hale's office by early afternoon and laid the document on his desk and watched his face. Edmund Hale was not a man who showed things easily, but when he saw the notation, he went very still in a way that told her everything she needed to know. He read it 3 times. Then he set it down and looked at her over his desk and said, "Where has this been?" "In a tin box under a farmhouse floorboard for 8 years, Elizabeth said. "And the owner of this document? Her son-in-law has agreed to testify. He has standing to present the document on her behalf. I've confirmed it." Hale looked at the notation again. "JC," he said. "I can place it in Caldwell's handwriting," Elizabeth said. "He uses the same notation in his county business records. I have 3 examples." Hale was quiet for a long moment. When he looked up, his expression was not triumphant. He was too careful for triumph this early. But it had something in it that she recognized as the specific satisfaction of a man who had been handed exactly what he needed at exactly the right moment. "This changes our approach Tuesday," he said. "I know," Elizabeth said. "We can no longer position this as a statutory technicality. This is willful fraud, knowing violation." He paused. "Greer is going to object to the document's introduction." "On what grounds?" "Chain of custody, possibly authenticity. He'll claim it could have been added to the document after the fact." He looked at her. "Can you counter that?" "The ink is 8 years old," she said. "The paper is consistent with the rest of the document. And I have a sworn statement from Clara Birch that her husband noticed the notation at the time of signing and asked Caldwell what it meant. Caldwell told him it was a standard approval mark." She paused. "Her husband wrote it down. In his journal, which Whitfield has." Hale looked at her. "There's a journal entry," Elizabeth said. "August 14th, 1809. Birch writes that Caldwell told them the JC mark was a standard approval. That's a contemporaneous record of Caldwell identifying his own notation." Hale set down his pen. He sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way of a man organizing something very carefully in his head. "Miss Carter," he said, "I have been practicing law in this state for 22 years. Elizabeth waited. "I have handled land disputes, inheritance contests, commercial fraud claims, and 2 cases that went to federal district." He paused. "You have just handed me a more complete evidentiary package than most trained attorneys assemble in 6 months. Elizabeth said nothing. "I want to be honest with you," he said, "because you deserve honesty. Greer is good. Caldwell has resources I don't. This hearing on Tuesday is preliminary. It's a stay determination, not a full verdict. Even if Carver grants the stay, the full case could take a year. In that year, Caldwell will work every angle he has. He will try to discredit the witnesses. He will try to reframe the narrative. He will try to make you the story instead of the fraud." "I know," she said. "And you're still here." "I'm still here," she said. Hale picked up his pen. "I'll need to prepare an amended argument for Tuesday. The notation changes the foundation of the presentation." He looked at her. "I'll need you present in the courtroom, not testifying, not for the preliminary, but present." "I'll be there," she said. "Dressed conservatively," he said. "No visible emotion during Greer's arguments. Whatever he says, and he will say things designed to provoke a reaction from you. Nothing on your face." "Understood," Elizabeth said. She stood up. She picked up her satchel. She looked at Hale across his desk. "Mr. Hale," she said, "can we win?" He held her gaze, precisely, professionally, without false comfort. "Yes," he said. "I believe we can." She was 2 miles outside Carwick on the road home when she saw the carriage. It was pulled to the side of the road, and it was Caldwell's. She recognized the horses. She recognized the shape of the man standing beside it. He was not alone. There was another man with him. Not Greer, someone she didn't recognize, heavier, with the look of a man whose job involved standing in rooms and being large. Elizabeth did not slow her horse. Caldwell stepped into the road. She pulled up. She looked down at him from the saddle, and she held her face entirely still. "Miss Carter," he said, "I was hoping to speak with you." "I'm not inclined to speak with you outside the presence of my attorney," she said. "This isn't a legal conversation," he said. "This is a personal one." He looked up at her with the expression she was coming to recognize as his genuinely unguarded face. Not the warm merchant smile, not the patient patrician courtesy. Something colder and more honest. "I want you to understand something. I have dealt with men who made the same mistake you're making. Men with better resources than you. Men with better lawyers. Men with more time and more money and more political connection." He paused. "Not one of them won." Elizabeth looked at him. "Not one of them had what I have," she said. Something flickered behind his eyes. "What do you have?" he said. "I have the truth," she said. "And I have it in writing." He studied her face. For the first time since she had opened her door to him 4 weeks ago, she saw something in him that was not calculated, not planned, something that moved too fast beneath the surface for him to suppress completely. He was not certain. He had been certain, until this moment. She could see that the certainty had just developed a crack. She held his gaze for 3 long seconds. Then she urged her horse forward. He stepped aside. She did not look back. But her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her hands on the reins, and she rode the last 2 miles to the farm faster than she needed to, because the fear and the exhilaration and the terrible weight of what Tuesday meant were all hitting her at once, and she needed to be home and alone and quiet before she let herself feel any of it. She put the horse in the stable. She went inside. She stood in the middle of her father's kitchen and pressed both palms flat on the table, the same table where she had stood 4 weeks ago with the debt letter in her hand, and she breathed. She thought about her father, about what he had told her once, when she was 12 years old and had failed to save a row of seedlings she'd been responsible for, and had cried about it in a way that had embarrassed her even at the time. He had sat down next to her and said, "The seedlings didn't fail because you were careless. They failed because the soil wasn't ready yet. So now you know something about that soil that you didn't know before. That's not failure. That's information." She had not failed yet. She had 3 days, and Caldwell was no longer certain. The next morning, she received a letter from Anderson. It was brief. It said, "Whitaker tells me Greer filed a supplemental motion this morning, requesting postponement of Tuesday's hearing on grounds of insufficient notice. Carver denied it. Hearing stands. W.A." Elizabeth read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her satchel. Caldwell had tried to buy himself more time. Carver had said no. She went to find Whitfield. She needed to prepare him for what Greer would do to him on Tuesday. The questions about his relationship to the document, the challenges to his credibility, the insinuations about motivation. He needed to know what was coming so that it didn't land on him cold in the middle of a courtroom. She found him at Clara Birch's farm, repairing a section of fence that needed work. He listened to everything she told him without interrupting. He asked 2 questions, both of them precise, both of them showing that he had been thinking about this more carefully than she'd given him credit for. "He's going to try to make me look like I have a grudge," Whitfield said. "Yes," Elizabeth said. "And what do I say to that?" "You say the truth," Elizabeth said. "You say you have a document. You say you have a journal entry. You say the numbers are what they are. You let the math be the argument." She held his gaze. "Greer can attack your motivation. He numbers say." Whitfield nodded slowly. "My father-in-law worked himself to death," he said. "Not because he was weak, because he was paying a debt that was designed to never end." He looked at her. "I'll stand up there and say so for as long as they let me." Elizabeth put out her hand. He shook it. A brief, firm grip, the handshake of 2 people who had made each other a promise. "Monday evening," she said. "Be at the courthouse steps by 8 in the morning Tuesday." "I'll be there," he said. She rode back toward the farm in the late afternoon heat. She was tired in a way that had moved beyond the physical, a deep, bone-level tiredness that was less about sleep and more about the weight of being the person that other people's hope was resting on. Mabel Harmon, Clara Birch, James Whitfield, old Samuel Breck, who she had visited again 2 days prior, and who had pressed her hand with his trembling one and said, "You're the first person in 17 years who believed me." The unnamed families who had stepped back, but who were watching, whether they admitted it or not. She was not naive about what she was carrying. She was not romantic about it. She knew that if Tuesday went wrong, if Carver denied the stay, if Greer successfully discredited the documents, if something she hadn't anticipated came out of Caldwell's side of the table, the weight she was carrying would not just crush her, it would crush them. She rode into the farm and found William Anderson sitting on the fence post at the edge of her property, which was where the road turned and gave a view of the fields and the farmhouse together. She pulled up. "You didn't send word you were coming," she said. "No," he said. "I wasn't sure you'd want me to." She looked at him. He looked tired too, she realized. Not in the way she was tired. His was different. The tiredness of a man who had been working quietly and without acknowledgement on something that mattered to him, and wasn't sure if he was allowed to say so. She dismounted. She walked the horse to the fence and looped the reins. "How are you?" he said. He asked it the same way he always asked, with the weight that expected honesty. "Frightened," she said. "Ready, both at once." She looked at the fields. "We have one more day." "I know. I want to go through the presentation with you tonight," she said. "The full thing. I want to say it out loud to someone who will push back." She looked at him. "Will you do that?" "Yes," he said. "Don't be kind," she said. "If there's a weakness, I need to hear it." "I won't be kind," he said. "I'll be honest." She picked up the reins. "Come inside then," she said. "There's work to do." They walked toward the farmhouse together in the long summer light, two people moving toward the same doorway, both carrying the weight of what tomorrow's tomorrow would bring, neither of them talking, neither of them needing to. The hearing was 36 hours away, and Elizabeth Carter had stopped being afraid of Thomas Caldwell. She was afraid of something much more specific now, the space between having everything she needed and having it be enough. That was a different kind of fear entirely. And it was the kind that meant you were close. She didn't sleep the night before the hearing. She tried. She lay down on her father's bed with the lamp out and the summer dark pressing against the windows, and she closed her eyes and her mind kept moving, running through the argument, checking the evidence sequence, anticipating Greer's objections, rehearsing the answers to questions Hale might be asked that she hadn't yet considered. She ran it all the way through twice, and then gave up pretending, and got up and sat at the desk, and went through her notes one final time in the lamplight. Anderson had stayed until nearly midnight the previous evening. They had gone through the full presentation twice. He had pushed back hard, the way she'd asked him to, and twice he had found angles she hadn't fully shored up, and they had worked through the responses together. When he left, he had stood at the door for a moment with his hat in his hand and said quietly, "You're ready." "I know the argument," she had said. "That's not what I meant," he had said. And then he'd walked to his horse and ridden off into the dark. She was still thinking about what he'd meant when the sun came up. She dressed carefully. Not elaborately. She didn't have the means for elaborate, and Hale had said conservative, and she understood why. She wore her best dress, which was dark blue wool, too warm for August, but the most serious thing she owned. And she pinned her hair back and looked at herself in the small mirror above the wash basin and said, out loud, to the woman looking back at her, "You know what's true. Let that be enough." Then she picked up her satchel and walked out to meet whatever the day intended to be. The Carwick Circuit Courthouse was a plain building that smelled of old wood and settled dust, and by 8 in the morning it had more people in it than Elizabeth had ever seen gather for a preliminary hearing in this county. She understood immediately that Caldwell had arranged this. The crowd was not accidental. He had made sure that the people of Carwick, the merchants, the farmers, the women who had listened to him at the market, the commissioners who owed him favors, were all present to watch a young woman be told that her case had no standing. He was staging a public defeat, and he had packed the room for it. She walked in anyway. Hale was already at the plaintiff's table. He looked up when she came in and gave her a single nod. Tight, professional. The nod of a man who had said everything he needed to say and was ready. She sat beside him. She set her satchel on the table. She did not look at the crowd. She looked at Greer. How was across the room at the defendant's table, a heavy-set man with excellent posture and the composed, slightly bored expression of a lawyer who was confident he was going to win before the first word was spoken. He was reviewing papers. He did not look up at her. Caldwell was seated behind him. He was wearing a better coat than usual. When Elizabeth entered, he had looked up, once, briefly, and then looked away. James Whitfield was in the gallery behind the plaintiff's table. He caught her eye when she sat down and gave her a nod that was steadier than she had expected. Beside him was a woman Elizabeth didn't recognize at first. Older, with bad knees that showed in how she had arranged herself in the seat. Clara Birch had come herself. Elizabeth had not asked her to. She had not even told her the hearing date with any expectation that she would attend. But Clara Birch was there, in the Carwick courthouse, on a Tuesday morning in August, because her son-in-law was about to testify on her behalf, and she had decided she was not going to let him do it alone. Elizabeth looked at her for a moment. Clara met her gaze and gave a small, firm nod. Elizabeth turned back to face the front of the courtroom. Judge Carver came in at 8:15. He was a compact man of 60, with the unhurried authority of someone who had been doing this long enough to know that rushing a proceeding never made it shorter. He settled at the bench, reviewed the papers before him, and looked out at the room with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was entirely without patience for theater. This is a preliminary hearing to determine whether a stay of collection shall be granted pending full review of the petition filed by Miss Elizabeth Carter against Mr. Thomas Caldwell, he said. This is not a trial. I am going to hear argument from both sides, and I am going to ask questions, and at the end of this morning, I am going to make a determination. Counsel will conduct themselves accordingly. He looked at Hale. Mr. Hale, your petition. Proceed. Hale stood. I was not a dramatic speaker. He did not perform. He presented the case the way he had written it, in clean, sequential logic, building from individual document to pattern, from pattern to statutory violation, from violation to demonstrable harm. He introduced the 9 agreements, each one labeled and indexed. He cited the Virginia Debt Statute and the specific language that established the legal interest ceiling. He introduced the county Elizabeth had copied at the Fredericksburg courthouse and demonstrated how each one corroborated the agreements in her possession. How was precise. He was methodical. He was, Elizabeth thought, watching him, exactly what this room needed. Not passion, not appeal, but the quiet, unstoppable weight of a man presenting facts in a sequence that could not be reasonably disputed. The crowd had come expecting to watch a young woman be dismissed. They were watching something different. She could feel it in the quality of the room's silence, which had shifted from the self-satisfied quiet of a settled verdict to the focused quiet of people who were actually listening. Then Hale introduced the Birch Agreement. He introduced it carefully, explaining the chain of custody, from Clara Birch's possession to her husband's care, then to James Whitfield's keeping upon his father-in-law's death. He introduced the journal entry, which Hale read aloud in full. And then he held up the document and said, without drama, without emphasis, in the margin of this agreement, in the handwriting of Thomas Caldwell, is a notation reading, Extended Rate Approved, J.C. We will demonstrate that this notation is consistent with Caldwell's known handwriting patterns in his county business records, and that it constitutes contemporaneous written confirmation that the defendant knowingly authorized an interest rate in excess of the legal ceiling. The room's silence changed again. Even Greer's posture shifted. Not much, but enough. Caldwell, behind him, went very still. Carver looked at the document that Hale's assistant placed on the bench. He looked at it for a long time. Counsel, he said to Hale, you're asserting this notation is in the defendant's own hand. Yes, Your Honor. We have 3 comparable samples from county records. And you have a contemporaneous witness record. A journal entry, Your Honor, dated August 14, 1809. The late Mr. Thomas Birch recorded that Caldwell identified the notation as a standard approval mark at the time of signing. Carver looked at Greer. Counsel. Greer stood, and to his credit, he recovered quickly. He challenged the chain of custody for the Birch document, argued that a document kept outside the court record system for 8 years had no verifiable integrity. He challenged the journal entry as hearsay, the record of a deceased man who could not be cross-examined. He argued that the handwriting comparison was insufficiently supported and should require expert examination before introduction. He was good. He was very good, and he knew exactly which technical levers to pull, and he pulled all of them. He spoke for 22 minutes. When he sat down, Carver looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Hale. Response? Hale stood. Your Honor, regarding chain of custody, Virginia evidentiary rules for civil proceedings do not require a formal chain of custody for private documents introduced by their original owner or that owner's direct representative. Mrs. Clara Birch, who is present in this courtroom today, is the original party to this agreement and can speak to its integrity. Regarding the journal entry, the late Mr. Birch's record falls under the recognized exception for contemporaneous personal documentation in civil fraud proceedings, as established in Harmon versus the County of Augusta, 1809. Regarding the handwriting, we are prepared to present the county record samples for Your Honor's direct comparison. Carver held out his hand. Hale placed 3 documents on the bench. The room watched Carver compare them. He took his time. He was not a man who performed consideration. He actually considered. The silence stretched for what felt like 3 full minutes. Then, he set the documents down and said, Mr. Greer, I'm going to allow the Birch document. The chain of custody objection is overruled. The hearsay objection is overruled under the contemporaneous exception Mr. Hale has cited. The handwriting question is a matter for full trial, but it does not preclude introduction at the preliminary stage. Greer's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He said, Understood, Your Honor. Elizabeth kept her face completely still. The twist, when it came from the last direction she had expected. Greer called one witness for the defense. Elizabeth had anticipated this. She had expected him to call a business associate, perhaps, or a county official who would speak to Caldwell's reputation and the standard practices of his lending business. She had prepared for that. He did not call a business associate. He called Thomas Prescott, the man who had shut his door in Elizabeth's face 3 weeks ago. Prescott came to the front of the room and took his seat and folded his hands in his lap, and Elizabeth looked at Hale and saw the same alertness in his face that she felt in her own chest, the sudden sharpening of a man recalibrating in real time. Greer said, Mr. Prescott, you currently carry a loan agreement with Thomas Caldwell, is that correct? Yes, sir, Prescott said. And have you found the terms of that agreement to be fair and clearly explained? Yes, sir, Prescott said. Mr. Caldwell explained it fully. I understood what I was signing. Have you experienced any difficulty with the interest structure? No, sir. It's been exactly what we agreed. Greer turned to face the room. Thank you, Mr. Prescott. He sat down. The message was clear. Here was a real borrower, a real farmer, someone who had done business with Caldwell and was not complaining. The implication was that whatever Elizabeth had assembled was an outlier, a misunderstanding, not a pattern. Carver looked at Hale. Cross, Mr. Hale? Hale stood. One question, Your Honor. He looked at Prescott. Mr. Prescott, your loan agreement with Thomas Caldwell. What is the interest rate specified in that document? Prescott's hands, folded in his lap, tightened slightly. I'd have to check the exact figure. Would you say it's approximately 2% per quarter? Hale said. A pause. That sounds about right. Not 3%? Not 3.5%? Prescott hesitated. It was the kind of hesitation that lasted less than a second, but had a weight you could feel from across a room. I believe it was around 2%, he said. Hale set a document on the table in front of him. Your Honor, I'm introducing the Prescott Agreement, which came into our possession through the county filing record. The interest rate specified is 1.9% per quarter, just below the legal ceiling. He paused. Mr. Prescott's agreement is priced differently from every other agreement we've introduced today. He let that land. That is consistent with a lender who applies punishing rates selectively to parties he assessed as less able to challenge him and standard rates to parties he assessed as more likely to push back. The room absorbed this. Prescott looked at his hands. Caldwell, behind Greer, was very still. Carver said, "That's enough, Mr. Hale." Hale sat down. Elizabeth had not known about the Prescott filing. She had retrieved it from the county records in Fredericksburg, but she had not shared it with Hale. She hadn't thought it was relevant. Hale had found it himself in the documents she'd given him and understood what it meant in a way she hadn't. She made a note to tell him later that she was grateful, and immediately set it aside because gratitude was for after. Greer made his closing argument. He was polished, and he was skilled, and he did his best with what he had, which had been significantly diminished in the past 2 hours. He argued that the pattern Elizabeth claimed was constructed, not real. He argued that the statutory question was complex and required full trial examination. He argued that Caldwell was a respected member of the community whose decades of business practice deserved more than to be dismissed on the basis of a collection of disputed documents. He argued well, but he was arguing uphill. Hale's closing was shorter. He summarized the 9 agreements, the county corroboration, the Birch notation, the Prescott discrepancy, and the Whitfield testimony, and he said, "Your Honor, the purpose of this proceeding is to determine whether this case has sufficient merit to warrant a stay of collection while full review is conducted. The evidence presented today demonstrates not only a plausible claim, but a documented pattern of statutory violation and knowing fraud. A stay is not only warranted, it is required by the integrity of this court's process." He sat down. Carver looked at his papers. He looked at the room. He said, "I'll take a recess." The recess lasted 40 minutes. Elizabeth sat at the plaintiff's table and did not move. She would not go outside. She would not stand in a hallway and make small talk and let the crowd read anything from her body that she did not choose to give them. She sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at the middle distance and breathed. Hale sat beside her and reviewed his notes. Anderson was in the gallery. She had seen him come in 30 minutes into Hale's argument. He had slipped into the back row without disruption, and she had not looked directly at him since. But she was aware of him, the way you were aware of something solid in a room that had a lot of unstable things in it. Whitfield came to the railing behind her during the recess. "That was something," he said quietly. "It's not over," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it was something." Clara Birch caught her eye from 3 rows back. The old woman gave her the same small, firm nod she had given at the start of the morning. Elizabeth nodded back. Then Carver came back in, and everyone sat down, and the room went immediately and completely quiet. "I've reviewed the petition, the evidence submitted by both parties, and the arguments presented this morning," Carver said. He did not look up from his papers initially, and then he did, and he looked at the room with the clarity of a man who had made a decision and was not uncertain about it. "The stay of collection is granted." Elizabeth's hands, flat on the table, pressed down harder. "The debt collection proceedings against the Carter farm are suspended pending full judicial review of the fraud petition." He looked at Greer. "Mr. Greer, your client is ordered to take no action toward collection, eviction, or property transfer during the period of review. Any violation of this order will be treated as contempt." He looked at Hale. "Mr. Hale, I expect a full filing within 60 days. The trial date will be set following receipt." He picked up his gavel. "This hearing is adjourned." The gavel came down. The room erupted. Not jubilantly. Not everyone in that room was happy, and several of Caldwell's associates were moving toward Greer immediately with tight, unhappy faces. But the sound that moved through the crowd was not the sound of a settled verdict. It was the sound of a room that had come in expecting one thing and received something else entirely, and was now recalibrating. Elizabeth sat very still in the middle of it. Hale put his hand briefly on the table beside hers, not quite touching her hand, but close enough to be a gesture. "First step," he said quietly. "I know," she said, "but a good one." "Yes," she said, "a good one." She stood up. She picked up her satchel. She turned around, and that was when she saw Caldwell. I was standing near the back of the room, which had partially emptied. Greer was beside him, speaking in a low, rapid voice. Caldwell was not listening to him. He was looking at Elizabeth across the room with an expression that was the most unguarded she had ever seen on his face. It was not anger. She had expected anger. It was calculation. The particular, rapid calculation of a man revising a strategy in real time. He was looking at her, and he was thinking. And she could see him thinking. And what she saw in his face as he thought was the thing she had been waiting for since the morning she found the letter under her father's desk. He was afraid of her. Not dramatically, not obviously. But the fear was there, beneath the calculation, and she could see it because she had been studying his face for 4 weeks. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned and walked out of the courtroom. The crowd outside on the courthouse steps parted around her in the slightly uncertain way of people who weren't sure yet which side of history they were standing on. She was aware of eyes on her. She was aware of the murmuring and the reshuffling of positions that was happening in real time as people processed what had just happened inside. She walked past all of it. She was halfway down the steps when she heard her name. "Miss Carter?" It was a woman's voice. She turned. It was the wife of one of the farmers who had stepped back 2 weeks ago, one of the 3 families who had withdrawn from the case when Caldwell went to the market. A woman named Ruth Pellman, perhaps 40, with the look of someone who had been arguing with herself for a long time. "Is it true?" Ruth said. "What they were saying in there, about the rates, about the way the agreements were written?" "Yes," Elizabeth said. Ruth was quiet for a moment. "We have a document," she said. "My husband and I. We've had it for 6 years." Elizabeth looked at her. She did not say anything immediately, because she understood that this moment needed to breathe. "The trial will take time," Elizabeth said. "Possibly a year or more, but it will happen. And if your document matches the pattern, it will matter." Ruth's jaw worked. She was clearly fighting something, not dishonesty, but fear, the same fear that had made her husband step back 2 weeks ago. The real and reasonable fear of a family that couldn't afford to lose what little they had. "What do I need to do?" Ruth said. "Bring the document to Edmund Hale in Fredericksburg," Elizabeth said. "Tell him I sent you. He'll tell you what it means and what your options are." She held the woman's gaze. "You're not obligated, but you have the right." Ruth nodded once. Then she turned and walked quickly back through the crowd. Elizabeth watched her go. Then she turned back toward the road. Anderson was at the bottom of the steps. He had his hat in his hand, and he was looking at her with something on his face that she didn't have a word for immediately. Not pride exactly. Not relief. Something quieter than both. She came down the rest of the steps and stopped in front of him. "The stay was granted," she said. "I heard," he said. "It's not over," she said. "I know," he said. "It's not over." He paused. "But Elizabeth, today, what you built and what happened in that room today, that's not nothing." "No," she said. "It isn't nothing." She was tired in a way that went all the way through her. The kind of tiredness that was also relief, also tension that hadn't fully released, also the beginning of understanding that the thing she had been holding up with both hands for 4 weeks was still standing. "Come back to the estate," Anderson said. "Mrs. Graves will—" "I need to go home first," Elizabeth said. I just need to go home." He understood immediately. He didn't argue or offer alternatives. "Tonight then," he said, "when you're ready." "Tonight," she said. She walked to her horse. She rode out of Carwick with the summer heat on her shoulders and the sound of the courthouse crowd fading behind her, and she let the road absorb the silence she had been carrying for hours. She thought about her father. She thought about the morning she had stood at his grave and said, out loud, to no one, or perhaps to him, "I found the letter. I know what happened. I'm going to fix it." She had not fixed it yet. Not fully. There was a trial ahead, and time, and Caldwell's inevitable next move. She was not naive about what came next, but she had walked into a courtroom with nothing but the truth, and 4 weeks of work, and a lawyer who believed her, and a son-in-law who had kept a document in a tin box for 8 years on the chance that someday it would matter. And the judge had said, This case has merit. This woman is right. And nobody is taking her farm while we find out how right she is." That was not nothing. She reached the farm in the early afternoon. She tied her horse. She stood at the door for a moment. The same door she had opened 4 weeks ago to find Caldwell on her porch. Then she went inside. She sat at her father's desk. She opened the seed ledger. She looked at the 30 years of careful handwriting, the planting cycles, the yield records, the careful notations about soil and season, and the stubborn, patient work of a man who believed in what the land could do if you listened to it properly. She ran her hand across the page. "First step," she said. Then she picked up a pen and started writing. She was adding her own entries to the ledger. The crops she had put in since her father died, the adjustments she had made to his rotation system, the first observations from the modified planting beds she had started in the North Field. She was adding her hand to his. She had been afraid to do that before. She wasn't sure why exactly. Some feeling that it was too soon, or that adding her notation to his was a kind of presumption, or simply that she hadn't been ready to acknowledge that the ledger was now hers to keep. She was ready now. She wrote for an hour. She wrote carefully, in the same style he had used, because that style was efficient and precise, and there was no reason to change what worked. She recorded what she had observed and what she had planted and what she intended. Then she closed the ledger. Then she cried. Not dramatically. Not with any sound she would have been embarrassed by in front of anyone. Just the slow, quiet tears of someone who had been holding something upright for a very long time and had finally found a moment when they could set it down briefly without anything collapsing. She cried for her father. She cried for Clara Birch's husband, who had died thinking he'd failed his family. She cried for old Samuel Breck, who had been right for 17 years and never believed. She cried because she was 26 years old and alone and frightened, and she had also, today, done something real. She let herself have it for exactly as long as she needed to. Then she wiped her face. She stood up. She went to the wash basin. She washed her hands. She had a letter to write to Hale about the Pellman family and their document. She had a note to send to Mabel Harmon about what had happened. She had to think very carefully about Caldwell's next move, because he would make one, and she needed to be ready for it before he made it. There was a great deal of work left to do. Elizabeth Carter sat back down at her father's desk, pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, and began. The letter from Greer arrived 8 days after the hearing. It was addressed to Hale, with a copy sent directly to the Carter farm, which told Elizabeth immediately that it was meant to be seen by her, meant to land with weight, meant to make her feel the size of what was coming. Greer did not waste paper on courtesy. The letter was 4 paragraphs, precise and cold, and it said that the defense intended to file a counterpetition challenging the jurisdiction of the Carwick Circuit Court, on the grounds that the aggregate financial claims now attached to the case exceeded the threshold for county-level adjudication and should be elevated to federal district court in Richmond. Elizabeth read it once at the kitchen table. Then she rode to Anderson's estate. He read it standing up, which she had come to understand was what he did when something required immediate thought. He set it down after the first read and said, "He's trying to move it out of Carver's court." "Yes," she said. "Carver granted the stay. Caldwell doesn't trust what Carver will do at trial. If he moves it to federal district, it takes longer," Anderson said. "Costs more. New judge, new procedural timeline. It buries everything Hale built. And it separates the case from the community where the harm happened," Elizabeth said. "Richmond doesn't know these farmers. Richmond doesn't know what Caldwell has been doing in this county for 20 years. Anderson was quiet for a moment. "Will Hale fight the jurisdiction move? He's already writing the response," she said. "But he told me it's not a certain defeat. Federal jurisdiction has a legitimate argument if the aggregate claims are large enough." She sat down across from him. "We need the Pellman document. And we need the 2 families who stepped back, who still haven't come forward. If the aggregate is large enough to trigger federal jurisdiction, I'd rather control that trigger than have Greer control it." Anderson looked at her. "You want to file additional claims yourself, voluntarily?" If I can get the documents, yes. Let the case be as large as it actually is. Federal court is harder and longer, But if Caldwell is going to force it there anyway, I'd rather walk in with everything than be dragged in with half of it. That's a significant risk, Anderson said. So is letting him choose the terms, she said. He held her gaze. Then he nodded. What do you need? I need to talk to Ruth Pellman today, and I need to talk to the Garfield family. They stepped back early, but they're the largest outstanding claim I know of. If I can get both of them to Hale by the end of the week, I'll ride with you, Anderson said. She started to say she didn't need him to, he said, before she could. Not to speak, not to intervene. Because the Garfields know me. I've done business with them for 4 years. And they might open a door for you that they wouldn't open alone. He paused. That's practical, not protective. You can tell me no. Elizabeth looked at him for a moment. That's practical, she agreed. Yes, he said. It is. She stood up. Get your horse, she said. Ruth Pellman opened her door before they reached the porch, which meant she had been watching the road. She looked at Elizabeth, and then at Anderson, and then back at Elizabeth, and whatever she read in the combination, it settled something in her that had apparently been unsettled for a week. I went to Fredericksburg, Ruth said. I saw Mr. Hale. Elizabeth stopped. When? 4 days ago. Took our document. She paused. He said it was consistent with the others. He said the rate on ours was 3.25%. She looked at Elizabeth with an expression that was caught somewhere between anger and the complicated relief of a person who has finally been told that the thing they suspected for years was real. We've paid him $280, Miss Carter, over 7 years. He said we likely overpaid by more than $60. That money can be recovered, Elizabeth said, if the full case succeeds. Ruth's jaw tightened. $60, she said. You know what $60 is to a farm like ours? Yes, Elizabeth said. I do. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, What do you need from me now? Your willingness to be named in the federal filing, if the case moves to Richmond, Elizabeth said. You don't have to testify yourself, but your document, with your name attached, as a voluntary complainant rather than a subpoenaed witness, it changes the weight of what we're presenting. What's the difference? A subpoenaed witness looks afraid, Elizabeth said. A voluntary complainant looks certain. Ruth looked at her hands, then at Anderson, briefly, then back to Elizabeth. You put my name on it, she said. Ruth Pellman. You put it right there with yours. Right there with mine, Elizabeth said. The Garfield farm was harder. Nathan Garfield was a careful man. Not unkind, not dishonest, but the kind of careful that had been built up over years of watching what happened to people who made noise. He was perhaps 50, with 2 sons who worked beside him, and he had been managing a Caldwell debt for 9 years that had grown in ways he had never fully understood, but had accepted as the consequence of a bad year and a necessary loan. He listened to Elizabeth in his kitchen with his sons at the table, and his wife at the stove, and his face doing the particular work of a man trying to hold his fear and his interest in the same expression simultaneously. When she finished, he said, You're asking me to put my name on a federal filing. Yes, Elizabeth said. Against Thomas Caldwell. Yes. In a court in Richmond. Possibly, she said. If the jurisdiction moves there. He looked at Anderson. You're involved in this. I'm a party with independent standing, Anderson said. As a landowner in affected counties, my involvement is separate from Miss Carter's case. He paused. But I'll tell you what I told her 4 weeks ago, Nathan. What she's built is more rigorous than most formal legal proceedings I've seen. And what Caldwell did to your family, he did to mine. Garfield frowned. He didn't do anything to your family. No, Anderson said. But he did it to people on land adjacent to mine. People I had a responsibility to know about and didn't because I wasn't looking. That's a different kind of debt, and I'm paying it. He let that land. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here because Miss Carter asked me to come, and because I believe she's right. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. One of the sons shifted in his seat. Then Garfield's wife, without turning from the stove, said, Nathan, show her the ledger. Garfield looked at his wife's back. She said, still not turning, The one you've been keeping, Show her. He pushed back from the table. He went to a cabinet in the corner and brought out a worn account book and set it in front of Elizabeth. She opened it. He had been recording his payments to Caldwell for 9 years. Every quarter, the exact amount, the date, the running total. He had never mentioned this to Elizabeth, had never offered it unprompted, had been sitting on 9 years of meticulous documentation. Elizabeth looked up at him. "I'm careful with numbers," he said, with a slight defensiveness that was actually pride, badly disguised. "Mr. Garfield," she said, "this is the most complete payment record I've seen in this entire case." He blinked. "Is it useful?" "It's extraordinary," she said. He looked at the ledger. He looked at the front window, which faced the road that went toward Carwick, where Caldwell lived. He looked at his wife's back. "Put my name on the filing," he said, "and my wife's, Margaret Garfield." He paused. "And you use that ledger however Hale needs it." Hale received the Pellman and Garfield materials by the end of the week and filed the expanded complaint the following Monday. He did not wait for Greer's jurisdiction motion to be decided. He moved first, filed the expanded complaint with the aggregate claims in the county court, and simultaneously notified the federal district clerk in Richmond of the filing and its scope, which put the jurisdiction question squarely in the court's hands rather than Caldwell's. Greer's response was immediate. He filed an emergency motion arguing that the expansion of claims was procedurally improper. Carver denied it in 2 days. Elizabeth heard about the denial on a Wednesday morning from Hale's letter and sat at her father's desk and read it 3 times and then sat back and looked at the ceiling and thought, "He is losing ground." Every move Caldwell made, Hale had a counter, and every counter was landing because the foundation Elizabeth had built was solid. Caldwell was a man who had operated for 20 years in a system that depended on people not looking too carefully. Now someone was looking. And the system didn't know how to stop her because it had never had to before. But she was not naive. She went back to Hale's letter and read the last paragraph, which she had been saving. He had written, "The defendant has retained additional counsel, a man named Horatio Vance from Philadelphia, who has argued before the federal district in Richmond on 4 occasions and won 3. He is significantly more experienced than Greer. I want you to understand that the landscape of the full trial has changed." She set the letter down. Horatio Vance from Philadelphia. Caldwell was no longer managing this locally. He was bringing in the weight of money and distance and reputation. The particular kind of legal artillery that was designed not to win arguments, but to exhaust opponents, to run them out of time and resources until they settled for less than they deserved just to make the process stop. She understood exactly what this was. She also understood that she had been expecting it. She rode to Anderson's estate that afternoon. She told him about Vance. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "How much will this cost to see through?" "Hale estimates another $150 for full trial preparation," Elizabeth said. "Possibly more if Vance files multiple procedural challenges." Anderson nodded slowly. "I'll cover it." "No," she said. He looked at her. "William." She held his gaze. "I know you mean it as support. I know there's nothing behind it except decency. But if this trial is funded by you, then when it's over, regardless of what I've built, the story will be that a woman got justice because a wealthy man paid for it. And the women who come after me, who don't have a William Anderson standing beside them, will see that story and believe it applies to them." She paused. "I need this to be funded by the case itself, by the people in it." He looked at her for a long time. "The people in it don't have much money," he said. "You know that." "I know," she said. "But there are 11 families now. If each of them contributes what they can, even $10, even $5, and Hale defers the remainder against the judgment, which he's already offered to do." "That's a lot of ifs," Anderson said. "Yes," she said. "It is." She met his eyes. "But it's the right way." Howe was quiet. He stood up. He walked to the window and stood there for a moment. Then he turned back. "There is one thing I can do," he said. "That doesn't go in your name or mine." She waited. I can speak to 3 men in Fredericksburg who have been watching Caldwell for years. Merchants, landowners, men who've suspected what he was doing, but had no grounds to act. If they choose to contribute to a public interest legal fund for this case, that's their decision. That's community support, not my money. He paused. Can you accept that? Elizabeth considered. If it's genuinely separate, she said. Genuinely separate, he said. She nodded. Then yes. He looked at her. And then he said quietly, almost like he was saying it to himself as much as to her. You know, most people would have taken the easier path 4 months ago. I'm not most people, she said. No, he said. You are not. The full trial was set for the 3rd week of October. The summer heat broke in September, and Virginia shifted into the particular amber clarity of early autumn. And Elizabeth spent those weeks in a rhythm she had built herself. Mornings working the farm, afternoons corresponding with Hale, evenings reviewing documents or meeting with the families who were now 11 in total. Each one a thread in the argument Hale was weaving into a case that had grown far beyond the single debt agreement she had found under her father's desk. She and Anderson fell into a pattern too, though neither of them named it. He came to the farm 3 evenings a week, sometimes to work through legal strategy, sometimes to read through the agricultural records she was building in her father's ledger, sometimes for no stated reason at all. She went to his estate twice a week to use the larger table in his study when she needed to spread out the full documentation. They rode together twice to Fredericksburg to meet with Hale. They had dinner together more often than not, simple meals that Mrs. Graves provided with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had stopped asking questions about the young woman's increasing presence in the household. They talked about everything except the thing that was becoming increasingly impossible not to talk about. Elizabeth was aware of it. She was not a naive woman, and she was not, she told herself firmly, a woman who would let the warmth of being known make her mistake proximity for resolution. She had too much at stake. She had too many people depending on her steadiness. She could not afford to be uncertain about anything right now, including herself. But she was human. And William Anderson was a man who listened when she spoke, who remembered what she said, who pushed back when he thought she was wrong, and deferred without resentment when she proved she was right. Who asked about her father's seed work, and remembered her answers 3 weeks later, and asked follow-up questions. Who had said, on a Richmond morning over bad coffee, that he had been alone for 10 years and wanted not to be. She was aware of it. She kept it at a careful distance. She did not do this perfectly. The night before the trial, she couldn't sleep again. The same as before the preliminary hearing. The same circling mind, the same restless accounting of everything she had done and everything that could go wrong. She was sitting at the desk at 2 in the morning when she heard the knock at the door. She went to the door with the lamp. Anderson was standing on the porch. He had his coat on over what appeared to be sleeping clothes, which told her he had been awake too, had made a decision, and had ridden over without entirely thinking it through. She looked at him. He looked at her. I couldn't sleep, he said. Neither could I, she said. She stepped back from the door. He came in. She set the lamp on the table, and they sat across from each other, the way they always sat, the table between them, the documents and the letters and the seed ledger spread across the surface. He looked at the ledger. You've been adding to it, he said. Since the hearing, she said. I've been adding to it since the hearing. Can I see? She turned it toward him. He read through the new entries, her notations, her observations, the adjustments she'd been making to her father's system. He read carefully, the way he read everything, and she watched his face as he did it, and saw the moment he reached the entry she had written the night of the preliminary hearing, when she had first opened the ledger and put her own hand in it. It was a longer entry than the others. It was less technical. It said, in her careful script, Today I kept what my father built. I intend to build further. The soil is good. The work is not finished. It is only beginning. He read it twice. He set the ledger down. Elizabeth, he said. Don't, she said quietly. I'm not going to say anything that makes tomorrow harder, he said. I promise you that. She looked at him. I just want to say one thing, he said. And then we can sit here in silence if that's what you need. Or we can go through the argument again. Or we can—" "Say it," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Whatever happens tomorrow, regardless of the verdict, regardless of Vance, regardless of Caldwell or the court or any of it, what you've done these past 4 months is already real. It can't be unmade. 11 families know what was done to them. Clara Birch knows her husband didn't fail. Samuel Breck knows he was right." He paused. "That existed before tomorrow, and it will exist after." Elizabeth looked at the table. "You said to me once that you needed this to be won on the law," Anderson said. "Not on my name, not on borrowed strength." He paused. "You were right, and tomorrow it will be." She was quiet for a long moment. The lamp between them burned steadily. Then she said, "What if it isn't enough?" "Then we try again," he said. "With what we learned. That's what your father did with his seeds, isn't it? He tried. He recorded what happened. He tried again." She looked at him. And for the first time in 4 months, Elizabeth Carter let herself be seen being afraid. Not performing capability. Not managing the distance between herself and vulnerability. Just sitting there, across the table from this man who had ridden over at 2 in the morning because he couldn't sleep either, and letting him see that she was 26 years old and exhausted and carrying something that was almost too heavy. He saw it. He didn't flinch from it. He didn't try to fix it. He just stayed. They sat at the table until nearly 4 in the morning, talking sometimes and quiet sometimes. And when Elizabeth finally felt sleep pulling at her, she said, "You should go." "I'll go," he said. He stood up. He picked up his coat. He stood at the door for a moment. "William," she said. He turned. "After tomorrow," she said. "Whatever happens, after tomorrow, I want to talk about the other thing." He held her gaze. Something in his face went very quiet and very certain. "After tomorrow," he said. "I'll be there." The trial was held in Carwick Circuit Court. Vance was exactly what Hale had described. Measured, precise, formidably prepared, with the unhurried confidence of a man who had won enough times to stop being worried about losing. He arrived in the courtroom wearing a coat that cost more than most of the plaintiffs in the gallery earned in a year, and he took his place at the defense table with the ease of a man for whom courtrooms were simply places he worked. Elizabeth looked at him once. Then she looked at Hale. Hale looked back at her with the same tight, ready nod as the preliminary hearing. They began. The trial lasted 2 days. Vance attacked the chain of custody for every document. He challenged the handwriting identification on the Birch notation. He called 3 character witnesses for Caldwell, who spoke to his 20 years of business in Carwick as a pillar of commercial integrity. He presented an affidavit from a financial expert in Richmond, who argued that the interest structures in question, while aggressive, were within the range of customary practice in Virginia commercial lending in the relevant period. Howe was very good. Elizabeth had not underestimated him, and she did not underestimate him now. She sat at the plaintiff's table for 2 days and kept her face absolutely still through all of it. And every night she went home and went through the day's arguments with Hale for 2 hours, and identified what had landed and what had not, and prepared for the next morning. On the second afternoon, Hale called James Whitfield. Whitfield sat in the witness stand with his hands on his knees and his jaw set, and he answered Hale's questions in the plain, level voice of a man who had decided what he was going to say and was not going to be moved from it. He presented the Birch agreement. He presented the journal entry. He read his late father-in-law's words aloud, in his own voice, and the courtroom was very quiet. Then Vance cross-examined him. Howe was not cruel. He was something more effective than cruel. He was methodical. He questioned Whitfield's understanding of the document. He asked about his financial background. He questioned whether a man who had kept a document for 8 years without bringing it to legal attention earlier had truly believed it was important at the time. He was patient and thorough, and he was working to make Whitfield look like a man with a grievance rather than a witness with evidence. Whitfield looked at him for a moment after the last question. Then he said, "My father-in-law worked every day of his life on that farm. He died 3 years ago believing he had failed his family. He died ashamed." His voice did not waver. I kept that document because I didn't know what to do with it. Then a young woman showed me what it meant, and I brought it here the same week she asked me to. That's the whole of it." The courtroom absorbed this. Vance looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "No further questions." Hale called Nathan Garfield. Garfield brought his ledger to the stand, 9 years of quarterly payments recorded in his careful hand, and presented it with the quiet, contained dignity of a man who had been careful with numbers all his life and was finally being asked to show someone why. Hale walked him through the total. What Garfield had paid. What the legal interest ceiling would have allowed. The difference between those two numbers. The difference was $93. Garfield said it aloud in the courtroom. $93. That's 2 seasons of seed money. That's what my sons would have had to start their own farms. He looked at the room. He took that from my grandsons. Vance did not cross-examine Garfield. Elizabeth noticed. She thought about what it meant that Vance had chosen not to engage Garfield, and she thought it meant that Vance was smart enough to know that a man with a 9-year ledger and $93 written at the bottom of it was not a witness you improved by questioning. The closing arguments were on the morning of the second day. Vance argued eloquently for 40 minutes. He built the case that Caldwell was a legitimate businessman whose practices, whatever their flaws, did not constitute fraud in the legal sense, that fraud required intent, and intent required proof beyond pattern, and what the plaintiffs had assembled was suggestion, not certainty. Hale stood up. He did not argue for long. He said, "Your Honor, the defendant's own handwriting states, on a document in this court's possession, extended rate approved. He did not write, rate adjusted. He did not write, standard rate. He wrote, extended. That word acknowledges that the rate exceeds the baseline. That word, in Thomas Caldwell's own hand, is the proof of intent that counsel claims does not exist." He sat down. Carver looked at both tables. He looked at the gallery, which was packed again. The same crowd, reshuffled and reoriented, leaning forward now instead of settling in for a predetermined verdict. He looked at Elizabeth, briefly, with an expression that was purely judicial, assessing, not sympathetic. Then he looked at his notes. "I'll have a verdict by afternoon," he said. The verdict came at 3 o'clock. Elizabeth was sitting at the plaintiff's table when Carver came in. She had not left the courthouse during the wait. She had sat with Hale and gone through documents she had already read 100 times, because the act of holding paper and reading words was something her hands knew how to do, and her hands needed something to do. Hale had said, during the wait, "Whatever he decides, you understand the appeals process is available to both sides." "I understand," she had said. "I want you to be prepared for any outcome." "I am," she had said. She was not. No one was ever fully prepared for outcomes that mattered this much. But she had said it because it was the right thing to say, and because Hale needed to hear it, and because she was Elizabeth Carter, who had stood at her father's grave with the mud on her boots and promised she would fix it, and she was not going to fall apart in the courthouse hallway. Carver sat. He looked at his written decision. He looked at the room. "In the matter of Carter et al. Versus Caldwell," he said, "I find for the plaintiffs." The room moved, not erupted, moved, the way a large body of people moves when something that has been suspended comes down. The interest structures documented in evidence constitute willful violation of Virginia Debt Statute Section 14, Article 3. The notation recovered from the Birch Agreement constitutes direct evidence of knowing violation. The pattern of selective application, demonstrated by the Prescott comparison, confirms deliberate targeting of vulnerable borrowers. He paused. Thomas Caldwell is ordered to repay all interest charges collected in excess of the legal ceiling across all agreements introduced into evidence, with the specific amounts to be calculated by the court-appointed auditor within 30 days. The Carter farm debt is hereby nullified in full. The defendant is further referred to the county prosecutor for review of potential criminal fraud charges. He set down his papers. This court is adjourned. The gavel came down. Elizabeth did not stand up immediately. She sat at the table for a moment with her hands flat on the wood and the sound of the room moving and reshuffling around her, and she felt the thing she had been carrying for 4 months shift in her chest. Not disappear, not dissolve cleanly, but shift, the way a weight shifts when you set it down somewhere solid. Then, Mabel Harmon was at the railing behind her, saying her name, and Clara Birch was beside Mabel, and James Whitfield had his hand on his wife's shoulder, and Ruth Pellman was crying quietly into a handkerchief, and Nathan Garfield was standing with his arms around his 2 sons, and old Samuel Breck, who had been right for 17 years, was sitting in his chair near the back of the room with his trembling hands folded on his cane and his eyes closed, moving his lips slightly, as if he was saying something private to someone who was not in the room. Elizabeth stood up. She turned around and looked at all of them. These people who had trusted her with their documents and their stories and their most vulnerable possessions. Who had walked into a courtroom when they were afraid. Who had put their names on papers and spoken words in public and stood up under questioning from a very good lawyer when they had every reason in the world to stay quiet. She didn't have words for what she felt. She hoped her face said something adequate. She put her hand on Mabel's, briefly. She nodded at Whitfield. She looked at Samuel Breck until he opened his eyes, and she held his gaze for a long moment, and then she said, clearly enough for him to hear, "You were right." He looked at her. His eyes were wet. He said, in his old, shaking voice, "I know I was, girl. I've known it for 17 years. And then, very quietly, "But it helps to have someone say it." Caldwell left the courtroom without speaking. She watched him go. He moved through the side door with Vance and Greer on either side of him, and he did not look at her, and he did not look at anyone in the gallery. He walked out quickly, and the door closed behind him, and he was gone. She thought she would feel something significant about that moment. She didn't, quite. What she felt was something more like the absence of weight, the particular relief of putting down something you have been carrying so long, you had stopped noticing how heavy it was. Hale found her in the corridor afterward. He shook her hand, a formal, proper handshake, and said, "Well done, Miss Carter." "Well done, Mr. Hale," she said. "The auditor will be in touch within the week to begin the overpayment calculations." He paused. "You should know. The prosecutor's office will likely contact you as part of the criminal referral. That process is separate from this one and may take considerable time." "I understand," she said. "You built something here," he said. "I want you to know that. The precedent this establishes in Virginia debt law." He stopped. He was not a man who spoke in excess, and she could see him deciding how much to say. "It will matter," he said, "beyond this case. It will matter to people you will never meet." Elizabeth looked at him. "That was always the point," she said. He nodded once, picked up his case, and walked toward the courthouse steps. Anderson was waiting outside. Of course he was. He was standing at the bottom of the steps with his hat in his hand, which she had come to understand was what he did when he was feeling something he hadn't organized yet. The afternoon light was long and golden, the kind that only happened in Virginia in October, and it made everything look like something worth keeping. She came down the steps. "Carver found for the plaintiffs," she said. "I know," he said. "Whitaker was inside. He came to tell me." She nodded. She stood in front of him. They looked at each other. "You said after tomorrow," he said. "I did," she said. "It's after tomorrow," he said. She looked at him. This man who had written a letter of introduction, who had sat across a table from her for 3 hours writing a letter to Richmond, who had ridden beside her in the summer heat and listened to her talk about her father's seeds for 20 miles, who had come to her door at 2 in the morning because he couldn't sleep and stayed until 4 because she needed someone to stay, who had covered a retainer without flinching and then immediately found a way to let her be independent of it, who had spent 10 years being careful and was now, she could see, deciding to stop. She said, "I need you to understand something first." "All right," he said. "This farm is mine," she said. "The work I'm building here, the demonstration planting, the teaching, what my father started, that's mine. Whatever happens between us, that doesn't belong to the relationship. That belongs to me." "Yes," he said, without hesitation, without negotiation. And I will disagree with you, she said. Often, probably. About agricultural methods and legal strategy and God knows what else. I don't yield because it's easier. I know that, he said. I've known that since you told me the seed packet wasn't for sale. She almost smiled. You remember that? I remember everything, he said, simply. She looked at him for a long moment. The courthouse steps behind her, the golden October light, the sound of Carwick going on around them in its ordinary way. The estate, she said. Your father's project. The agricultural estate, yes. I want to see it, she said. Not to take it over, not to redesign it. She paused. I want to see what he was building, and I want to think with you about what it could become. Anderson looked at her. Something shifted in his face. Something that was so thoroughly relieved and so thoroughly careful at the same time that she felt it move through her own chest. I'd like that, he said. Very much. She put out her hand. He looked at her hand. Then he looked at her face. And he took her hand. Not in a handshake, not exactly, but in the way of two people deciding something, and held it for a moment in both of his. Miss Carter, he said. Elizabeth, she said. Elizabeth, he said. Thank you for letting me be part of this. She looked at him. Thank you for knowing how, she said. The months that followed were not simple. They were not the clean, easy resolution of a story where the hard part stops when the verdict comes down. Caldwell's appeals delayed the overpayment calculations for 3 additional months. The criminal referral moved slowly through the prosecutor's office and would not be resolved for over a year. 2 of the families whose claims had been upheld found that the practical recovery of their overpaid amounts required additional legal effort, and Hale was engaged on their behalf for months beyond the trial. Elizabeth knew all of this. She had known it was coming. She had built for the long arc, not just the verdict. What she had not fully anticipated was what the verdict did to the community around it. The Carwick Gazette ran the story of the trial on its front page. The editor, the same man who had avoided her eyes on the street after Caldwell visited him, wrote a factual account that was not exactly an apology for the previous silence, but was notably careful in its accuracy. 3 other newspapers in neighboring counties picked up the story. Hale wrote a brief legal commentary that was published in a Richmond journal documenting the statutory precedent. By the end of October, Elizabeth had received 7 letters from women in other Virginia counties asking whether the precedent applied to debt agreements in their own situations. She wrote back to every one of them, by hand, at her father's desk, in the evenings when the farm work was done. She directed them to Hale. She directed them to county court records. She directed them to each other, where she could, connecting a woman in Fredericksburg with a woman in Culpeper who appeared to be dealing with the same lender, giving them the language she had learned and the framework she had built, and the knowledge that the argument could be made because she had made it. This was not, she understood, a dramatic thing. It was a quiet thing, a slow thing, the kind of thing that didn't look like much from the outside, and that built, year over year, into something that mattered. Her father had spent 15 years writing letters to a man he never met and learning what he learned. She understood that work now in a way she hadn't when she was young. Anderson finished his father's agricultural estate in the spring of 1818. Elizabeth was there when the last of the construction was complete, a long, practical building designed for instruction, with tables and storage for seed varieties and a room for records. She had been involved in its design, not as an architect, but as the person who understood what the space needed to do, what her father's system required, how farmers actually worked and learned and needed information presented to them. Anderson stood beside her and looked at what they had built. "What are you going to call it?" she said. "I was thinking about that," he said. "I thought, the Carter method. For the system. Your father's system." Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. "Robert Carter's agricultural system," she said. "That's what the seed ledger calls it." "Then that's what it is," Anderson said. She looked at the building. She thought about her father, who had traded letters with a man in Tennessee for 15 years, and never once received credit for the knowledge he accumulated and shared freely with anyone who asked. who had kept a ledger for 30 years that sat under a floorboard until his daughter found it, who had built something real and lasting and been taken advantage of because he was too good at trusting that the world was honest. He would have liked this, she said. Yes, Anderson said. I think he would. She turned and looked at him. The spring air was warm, the particular warmth of Virginia coming out of a long winter, and she had been standing beside this man for 8 months now in all the practical and complicated ways that two people stood beside each other when they had decided to do so. I have something to ask you, Anderson said. She looked at him. How was holding his hat? Of course he was. He always held his hat when he was feeling something he hadn't organized yet. And he looked at her with the direct, uncalculating attention that had been the first thing she'd noticed about him at the Carwick market, when she had been selling her father's seeds, and he had walked up and said, "That's a Hopi white corn variety. I'm not asking out of rescue," he said. "I want to be clear about that. You don't need rescuing. You have a farm and a legal precedent, and 7 letters from women who found you on their own, and a seed ledger that your father built, and you are continuing to build. You have a future that belongs entirely to you." "I know," she said. "I'm asking because I want to build something beside you," he said. "Not instead of what you're building. Beside it." He paused. "I want to stop being careful about everything, except the thing that actually matters." Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the woman who had stood at her father's grave 4 months ago with the mud on her boots and the debt letter in her fist, and no one in the world she could call on. She thought about what that woman had believed was possible, and what had turned out to be more possible than she had dared to imagine. She thought about her father writing letters for 15 years to a man he never met, and the Tennessee farmer writing back, and neither of them knowing what they were building together until it existed. She thought about the word beside, not beneath, not behind, not saved or rescued or handed something that should have been hers anyway. Beside. Yes, she said. It was a simple word. It did not need ornamentation. It had the weight of everything she had earned, and everything she had chosen, and everything she intended to build with what she had. And it was enough. Anderson let out a breath that had apparently been held for some time. Then he smiled. A real smile. Not the careful, composed expression she had learned was his public face, but the genuine one. The one that made him look younger and less armored, and entirely like a man who had just been handed something he had not been certain he deserved. She put out her hand. He took it. And there, in front of the building they had built together, in the spring of 1818, in the Virginia county, where her father had farmed for 30 years, and where Thomas Caldwell had believed no one would ever look too carefully, Elizabeth Carter made her choice. Not because she had been rescued, not because she had been saved, not because a wealthy man had seen her at a market and decided to give her something she couldn't have gotten on her own, but because she had fought for every inch of ground she stood on. Because she had gathered the evidence and built the argument and walked into the courtroom and proven what was true. Because she had carried 11 families through a legal proceeding that changed the law for people she would never meet. Because she had taken her father's seed ledger and added her own hand to it and kept building what he had started. She had stood in the only way she knew how, on her own 2 feet, on her own ground, in her own name. And from there, only from there, she had chosen to let someone stand beside her. That was not weakness. That was not compromise. That was not the story of a woman who needed saving. That was the story of a woman who had always known her own worth, and had simply waited for the world to catch up.